Hello everyone, welcome to the Drydock episode 257. This is of course the Patreon Drydock, so this is part 1 that you're listening to. And well, if you're listening to this, hope you're settling in for a good few hours, or you're going to watch it many times to catch up on the bits you missed, because, well, we are going to be here for a while. In any case, let's begin. John McDonough asks, I've recently been rereading about the gunnery revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. According to the author, a conspiracy developed between the Admiralty, as represented by Scott, Jellicoe and Fisher, and the US Navy, as represented by Sims, Fiske and Poundstone, amongst others. It seems the individuals involved shared what amounted to national security data and went so far as to fake statistical data to help the other side against their own governments. Is this true, and how was it possible for them to get away with this for so long? Okay, so first thing you have to do with this is you have to set the context and add an important qualifier. The qualifier is that Sims, Fiske, Poundstone in the US Navy, Scott, Jellicoe, Fisher in the Royal Navy, they are basically factions within a navy. They do not represent, strictly speaking, the entirety of the navy. None of them are in the ultimate command positions that some of them would later reach. Additionally, the big qualifier is the cultural one. These days, the idea of two navies, or even officers within two navies, even if somewhat allied, sharing information about the latest and greatest in fire control systems seems completely anathema. It would breach dozens of security and secrecy laws. It would be the end of careers. It would be a complete catastrophe on all sides. And these days, given that a lot of stuff, almost all stuff, is done by private companies rather than internally by the Navy or by the government, it will probably also be a bunch of IP theft and copyright issues as well. That's not the case at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, not by a long shot. There are obviously some IP and copyright issues to do with private company inventions, but on the whole, things are a lot more open. Now, they are rapidly changing, to be fair. National security and particular rivalries between particular countries is coming in at a very, very fast pace. But to give you some idea, at the beginning of the 1900s, the Royal Navy's supplier of fuses for their shells was Krupp. Yeah, the one in Germany, which caused something of an issue when, in the middle of the 1900s, Krupp suddenly refused to sell them to the Royal Navy anymore, and the British had to go, when was the last time we built a working shell fuse? Oh, about 15, 20 years ago. We better learn quickly, and as World War I proved, they didn't quite learn quickly enough. And even by the middle of the 1900s, one of the big reasons the Germans didn't fit the Parsons turbine to the Nassau class, there were a few different ones, but one of the big ones, wasn't that it was an English technology and that they may therefore not get parts and maintenance or service from them, or they might be sold at dud deliberately to sabotage their national security. It was simply the fact that Parsons, they felt, was asking far too much money as a commission to sell their technology to a foreign nation. So it was just a financial decision more than anything else. And that's when you're talking about two countries that, at least since Kaiser Wilhelm II had come to the throne, had a certain degree of friction going on between them in geopolitical terms. The 1890s, early 1900s US Navy, on the other hand, had pretty much zero geopolitical tension with the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had shown up, obviously, in the Apia-Samoa dispute to watch the Americans and the Germans argue about who would keep it, but they didn't really care much either way. They just wanted to keep an eye on things and make sure that peace in the Western Pacific was maintained. The US Navy, although obviously you'd had the Great White Fleet, was not seen as a particularly expansionist power, and they weren't going after anything that was particularly within British interests. The last time Britain and America had any really significant major disagreement was when the Americans kind of, cooed and overtook Hawaii, although, again, in the great manner of the 19th century, whether or not that was done by the American government or by American private interests is still a topic of ongoing debate. Hawaii, of course, having been previously quite friendly and aligned with the British. Nonetheless, this all kind of serves the point that Fisher or Scott, corresponding with Sims and both exchanging notes on ways to improve their gunnery is not at all unusual behaviour back then. And considering that some of the US admirals listed in that question, and certainly Fisher and Scott, and to a certain extent Jellicoe, saw politicians as bureaucrats who were problems to be overcome rather than worked with in a lot of cases. Yeah, the idea that, slip a quick letter to my friend over in the States and then, make him look really, really good, or vice versa. Obviously in the US, slipping a note over to their friends in the UK, and then suddenly being able to go, oh yes, but look, there are our potential, honestly, transatlantic rivals over the pond. They've suddenly got much, much better technology. Clearly, we must spend lots of money in order to make our technology better to catch up with them, because otherwise that would be very neglectful of, insert name of country here, national security interests, wouldn't it, Mr. Politician? And it would be absolutely terrible if, concerned captains and admirals happened to write to some national newspapers at a time of local election and point out that the current governing party really wasn't that interested in defending the nation against its potential naval threats. So, if you just allocate a bit more money to the budget and let us play around a bit with our new fancy gubbins, none of that has to happen. So, yeah, it's not so much Sims and Scott, etc., conspiring to share national security data with each other. It's more both of them conspiring to flip one over on all the politicians they ultimately rather despised. Nick Brodar asks, I've only seen the US Navy Green Aviators uniform in reference drawings, never in photos. How common was it? It was pretty common in terms of its existence, but in terms of it being captured on camera, it is somewhat rarer, and that's because it was never the single dominant aviator uniform. It was a winter version, and its origins come from the US Navy aviators going, you know what, it's actually really cold flying around in an open cockpit biplane in the North Atlantic or places like that, in the where the early US Navy Air Corps was operating. And so they basically nabbed the US Marines uniform and said, this is nice and warm, we'll fly in this. However, whilst that was the official winter uniform, there was a khaki summer uniform, because whilst this is indeed a relatively warm uniform, it's not something you want to be doing, want to be wearing in the middle of the Pacific, or based out of San Diego or somewhere like that, because you will die of heat stroke, basically. So it becomes much less visible because, of course, when Langley and then Saratoga and then Lexington, or Lexington then Saratoga, and then the Yorktowns and Ranger, etc. all come in, they spend the vast majority of their time based down in at least Norfolk, if not the Caribbean and San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc., the warmer ports. And most of the US Navy fleet problems of the interwar period are conducted in warmer waters. Very rarely are they done in colder waters. And, of course, the Pacific is mostly fought in the warmer waters of the Pacific. There's a few operations in the more northern climes, but not that many. And so, as a result, sailors are going to get, aviators, I guess, are going to get much, much more use out of the khaki uniform that they have and various permutations thereof, as opposed to their nice, insulated, rather heavier green uniforms. And so the khaki ones, and as I said, variations thereof, are what you're going to see by far the most of in the vast majority of situations. Plus, of course, somewhere in the 1930s, the US Navy moves over to, at least in theory, enclosed cockpits, albeit you will see plenty of photos of people looning around in aircraft with theoretically enclosed cockpits, but they're keeping them open anyway, but that's their personal choice. But the long and the short of it is essentially that the problem that the Green Aviators uniform was designed to solve, namely sitting in an open cockpit and freezing to death in the high latitudes, pretty much had disappeared from the US Navy very shortly after its introduction, by a combination of not being in those high latitudes anyway, and if you were in an area that was cold, perhaps up north or anywhere else, by the time that became a serious issue, you were probably in an enclosed cockpit aircraft with a little onboard heater anyway, so you'd probably still be wearing your khakis. And so you don't really see it all that much, although apparently, according at least to the US Navy History and Heritage Command, it was apparently uniform regulation until something like the 1980s. So there you go. Greb asks, I was reading about the Monmouth class, and it stated that around 1915 the lower casemates were relocated and the casemates were welded shut, but I can't seem to find any pictures or drawings after the refit. Do you have any that either show the new gun layouts? Well, ask and ye shall receive. Here is the front 2/3-ish of HMS Suffolk, circa 1919. The reason you won't find too many photos of the Monmouth class is, to be honest, a lot of them weren't doing a huge amount in the second half of the First World War, and they were mostly on secondary stations, which didn't tend to attract as many photos. But, as you can see here, this is, as I said, HMS Suffolk, and you can see the forward double stack casemate has been indeed plated in, and you can also see between the second and third funnels that the amidships lower casemate has been plated in. So historically the ships had two double stack casemates, one at the bridge and one at the other end, and then the lower single casemate in the middle. And you can see what they've done here is the lower gun from the forward casemate has been moved to sit between the first and the second funnels, and the gun from the amidships casemate has just literally been moved up one deck level. It's still in exactly the same location relative to the length of the ship, it's just one bit higher. Now, obviously we can't see what's happened to the third gun, the one from the aft double-stacked casemate, but I suspect that you will probably find that gun is somewhere between the third funnel and the mainmast further aft. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, was it more a technological or a tactical issue that delayed the development of fire control systems in warships? It was definitely a technological issue. Various navies would absolutely love to have a range superiority over their opponents, not just for the battle line engagement, but because, remember, for at least 20 years of the last part of the 19th century, torpedoes were an increasing worry. So the ability to either get beyond the range of torpedo boats with your guns, or at least a good chunk past the optimal engagement range of torpedoes, even if you're not beyond the maximum engagement range, would still be great. But there were several factors involved. For one thing, fire control systems need accurate ranging data. So before you could develop a fire control system per se, outside of electrical firing for all the guns, you needed to have a rangefinder of some description being invented. And it's not just a case of, well, we've invented a coincidence or stereoscopic rangefinder. Okay, those things were present on land a little bit sooner, but you've then got to develop one that is long range enough to actually make a difference. So it's got to exceed 2,000-3,000 yards effective range accurately. And then you've got to make the whole thing capable of dealing with the conditions you find at sea, which is a rather large technological obstacle, especially for something that is, relatively speaking, delicate, and by its nature has to have at least part of itself exposed to the elements. So once they figured all that out and you have rangefinders start to come in, then you can think about the fire control systems, and the fire control systems have to be able to withstand the conditions at sea. Now, with the fire control tables like this Dreyer table, you can lock them deep away in the ship. So you're not necessarily having to worry about them getting wet, but you do have to come up with a system that's capable of making lots of different calculations and constantly updating itself. See the entire video I did on range finding and fire control as a reference for how complex some of that can be, and that's a very high level introduction to the topic. But you then have to come up with a system where the system itself is not going to fall over the minute the ship takes a sharp pitch, but also all those calculations, all the little gears and wheels and everything, they have to not be thrown off by the movement of the ship. And then on top of all of that, It's actually got to be accurate enough, and that's, a very delicate procedure, because you could come up with something that's relatively crude, uses massive great gears, much less vulnerable to the various accelerations in 3 dimensions you get from a moving ship, but then the data won't be of much use. So by refining it, you make everything a little bit smaller, a bit more delicate, it's a bit more precise, but much more vulnerable. So this is why there's a huge amount of work that goes into it, and why iterative improvements on these systems continue as they're constantly able to refine smaller elements of it. And again, the principles underlying it were well understood and could even be recreated on land considerably before everything ended up going to sea, partly because of all the reasons we just mentioned, but partly also just because of miniaturization. Any one of the equations involved in a fire control computer could be solved by hand, but solving all of them at once and continuously, you have to use a machine. But then the machine itself has to be miniaturized. So you look at the difference engine as proposed by Charles Babbage. That's a few decades before fire control systems come in. Now, granted, the difference engine is a little bit more complicated, but you look at the sheer size of that thing, and you realize, yeah, you technically could have taken it to sea, but you wouldn't be able to fit all that much else in most warships of the period. So being able to take what's essentially a single, well, not single, but a smaller subset of functions out of something as complicated as a difference engine, still a fairly chunky bit of kit, and then coming up with a way to miniaturize that down to a level where it can fit in a single room on a battleship is, it's a progressive technological feat. In the same way that, at the end of World War II, we had computers that were the size of a room, and these days a computer chip that can fit inside a wristwatch can massively outperform the old computers they used at Bletchley Park. Kevin Webber asks, can you discuss the evolution of watertight compartments? Did they originate with naval or civilian ships? Were there any singular profound events that specifically changed doctrine or design over time? Also, how do they prevent water from entering damaged electrical conduits or ventilation systems and spreading to other parts of the ship? Or does it just spread and they assume that normal pump operations can handle that load? So there's 2 essential starting points to the origins of watertight compartments in ships. Firstly, in, as far as we can tell, somewhere around the 12th or 13th century, the Chinese and Indian shipbuilders already had some form of watertight compartmentalization going on. Interestingly enough, the historical accounts state that at least for the Indian merchant marine, the reason for this was that their ships' hulls were relatively lightly built, and there was an unusual interplay with the wildlife, namely that when they were moving through the sea at night, their bows waves would kick up phosphorescent algae, which is a phenomenon that's fairly well known in tropical waters. But apparently there were whales in significant number in what today we would call the Indian Ocean, who were attracted to the phosphorescent algae, who decided that this meant there was something to feed on, and according to the accounts, they would rush up from the deep expecting a meal and smash into the boat, which would, punch a hole in the boat and cause a leak of varying degrees of severity. I'm not a whale biologist, so I don't know if there's a species of whale in the Indian Ocean that still has a feeding habit of going after disturbances on the surface that cause phosphorescence among algae. Maybe someone in the comments does, but apparently that was a thing back then. And I guess, the kind of evolutionary pressure of which ships sink and which ships don't had forced them to construct vessels that had multiple subdivided watertight compartments, which were double planked and then sealed with special preparations, which were held by the observers to actually be better than pitch for watertightness. Exactly when these techniques developed in the Indian and Chinese merchant fleets, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. But it seems that the idea in principle translated over to Europe eventually after reports reached Europe. But one of the big problems that European ships found when implementing this idea was that on wooden vessels, it was almost impossible to implement a long-term watertight bulkhead. Now, a number of the Indian and Chinese trading ships have a somewhat different design to European ships, which, without going into the construction details of Chinese junks and Indian trade ships versus European ships, the long and the short of it is basically the Chinese and Indian ships are quicker and easier to build. For a given set of dimensions, they can hold slightly more cargo, but they are overall somewhat lighter built and less suited for extreme deep ocean navigation on a long-term basis in rough seas, with obvious exceptions like Chinese treasure ships and so forth. Whereas the European vessels generally are dealing with, the North Sea and the North Atlantic all the time. They tend to be deeper keeled, a little bit more rounded, etc. And whilst wooden ships would have a certain degree of internal compartmentalization, if you happen to visit HMS Victory, you can, when you get down into the hold, you'll see the hold is divided into a couple of major sections by what you might term a bulkhead. But they're not fully watertight because the ships work in heavy seas. Wood is a fairly flexible material, and so even if it would in theory be a watertight compartment when it left dock, after several months or possibly even years at sea, it will have worked itself so it's water resistant, but it's not going to stop flooding. It's just going to slow it down. But once you got over to iron ships, which is why the East India Company ship Nemesis is pictured here in a gale, iron ships, of course, the hull material is a lot more rigid, the framing is a lot more rigid, and of course internal bulkheads made of iron can also be a lot more rigid, and because you don't have to make iron in planks, you make it in big sheets, you can also either make sheets large enough to fit an entire frame, or you can, seal them up really, really well with rivets, and thus watertight bulkheads in the fully watertight sense in theory become a thing pretty much as iron ships come about in the 1830s and 1840s, and that carries forward into the rest of history. So there's not one singular event that says we need to implement these things, but perhaps the invention of iron ships is the singular event that allows them to be truly effective, assuming that everything else is designed properly. In terms of things like electrical conduits, ventilation systems, etc., preventing, and how do you prevent flooding getting through the bulkheads? Well, there's two ways of doing it. One is that you can route these things away from the bulkheads. So if you want to have bulkheads kind of like the Titanic, I guess, going up a certain level in the ship, you can route these things up and over the bulkheads and just accept that higher up, perhaps that won't be watertight, but maybe have hatches in the floor-ceiling, and you make sure that those floors are sealed, and that'll resist the water somewhat, etc., etc. But often you don't have that option, especially on later larger ships. And with systems like ventilation systems and voice pipes and so forth that have a physical gap, which is as designed, water spreading through that, then there's two main measures, one of which is to have the actual exits closable, but also to implement a system of valves within the actual system. So the ventilation system, you could close it into individual segments with valves, the voice pipe similarly, and in theory that would hold. And with the electrical conduits, firstly, you would make the hole through the bulkhead, if you had to, the absolute smallest it needed to be. And then once you've fed the wire through, depending on the type of insulation you're using, hopefully either the insulation will expand and swell up around it, but you'd also seal it with additional sealant, and you'd hope that the pressure of all of that and the adhesion would be enough to repel the water. But of course, these ways of sealing the electrical systems, they're only good down to certain pressures. So you'll be seeing a video on the K-class subs coming relatively soon, I think later in the following month on this channel, and you'll see there that if your electrical conduits and other piercings of the bulkheads are rated for 15 pounds per square inch, 15 psi pressure, that's great, and perhaps on the surface that would be fine. But if you are 50 foot, 100 foot down and you end up with a leak, and it turns out, well, the water pressure is now 25 psi, it's going to force its way through those openings anyway. And As you'll see with the K-class, not having the valves closed on a voice pipe can lead to all sorts of interesting shenanigans once it starts turning itself into the world's largest and highest pressure super soaker. Nicholas Ressar asks, this might lean slightly outside the time boundaries for the channel, but between Texas and the Iowas, which ship or class do you think went through the biggest changes in their service lives? Now, that's a really interesting question, because in theory, you could construct a pretty decent argument for either one, but I think it comes down to exactly how you're viewing biggest change. So if you were viewing biggest change in the context of this is the technology level that the ship had when it was launched versus this is the technology that the ship had when it left service, then the biggest change would definitely be the Iowas, because they were launched into a world of mostly still analog systems, obviously electromechanical fire computers and things like this, with early radar. And by the time they finish their careers, there's modern millimeter radar all over the place. They've got missiles aboard. They may or may not have nukes aboard. They've got jammers, decoy, chaff launchers, etc., which is obviously a massive technological difference. And on top of that, we're not talking about, very early generation surface-to-surface missiles or whatever. We're talking about harpoons and tomahawks and things like that. But the other argument, which personally I would favour, would say that Texas is actually the one that sees the biggest changes in their service lives, because the changes to the Iowas, as radical as they are on a technological basis, are what I would call surface level. So, you've taken some 5-inch guns off, you've stuck some missile launchers on, you've changed out the old radar for new radar, you've changed out the old radios for new radios, etc. So these are mostly, apart from missiles, systems that were already there. They've just been replaced with better and more diverse ones. And even the armament refit has, I suppose adding the drone on the back as well, it's taken stuff that's on the exterior of the ship and just replaced it with something different. Whereas if you look at Texas, and this is, with the Iowa refits, they didn't change the torpedo defense system. They didn't change the propulsion, the main battery, the overall form of the ship, apart from that refit at the back for the missiles with taking off the 5-inch guns. With Texas, on the other hand, she went from having essentially, near as enough as makes no difference, zero anti-aircraft armament to having quite a significant anti-aircraft armament. So that's a whole entire field of weaponry that's been introduced on Texas, as opposed to the harpoons and the tomahawks, which ultimately are surface-to-surface attack weapons, just longer range than the main guns are. Her secondary battery is revised. She receives, obviously, upgrades in fire control equipment, but she receives radar, something that she physically did not have before. As you can see here, this is obviously during her refit in Galveston, but she goes from being a ship with a single kind of hull design to a ship that is completely refitted to include these anti-torpedo bulges. So it's including a new defense system that physically alters the ship. And then even internally, she switches fuel types, albeit they don't change the vertical triple expansion engines, but completely different set of boilers and ways of storing fuel. The propulsion system's completely overhauled. That doesn't happen on an Iowa. The Iowa's running on oil fuel and the same turbine systems as when they were launched. Now, of course, Texas goes out of service at the end of World War II, and you could argue that perhaps with the exception of radar and an anti-aircraft battery that's actually worth mentioning, everything else is, like with the Iowa's, iterative progressions on stuff that was already on Texas. She already had a hydrocarbon burning fuel plant, etc. But the physical effect of those changes on Texas runs a lot deeper all the way through the ship. Whereas, as I said, on Iowa, it's mostly a surface application of new stuff. At least in my opinion. Other people, of course, may disagree. Sam Signorelli asks, what makes a gun dual purpose rather than single? I don't think it can simply be the difference in ammunition, because otherwise if you fire HE and AP rounds, you could consider that dual purpose. And secondly, what makes an effective dual purpose gun? There are a number of factors that go into making a gun dual purpose rather than single. And bear in mind, you can have single purpose guns in either direction, either anti-surface or anti-air. So saying, oh, a dual purpose gun has an increased elevation, no, that's the difference between a single purpose surface action gun and a dual purpose gun. A single purpose anti-aircraft gun will have high elevation anyway. So, okay, one of the differences between a single purpose and an anti-air and a dual purpose gun will be that they can fire two kinds of ammunition at least. Okay, maybe there may be three kinds, but essentially that they can fire anti-aircraft ammunition and anti-surface ammunition. Although for most guns that may more be a product of, do they actually manufacture the rounds? Because if they do, the gun can probably fire them. There's not a huge amount of difference to the gun itself when you fire an AP round, an HE round, or an anti-aircraft round. The ballistics might be different, how far the shell goes might be different because of the shell weights, but the gun itself isn't really going to care all that much. And theoretically, any anti-aircraft gun can also be an anti-surface weapon, it just may not be a particularly good one. And I think that's the key qualifier, the effective dual-purpose weapon. So if you consider the role of a dual-purpose gun aboard a warship in the Second World War, it had to be able to engage surface targets, which basically meant it had to at least be capable of meaningfully engaging and stopping destroyers. Ideally bigger stuff as well, but destroyers as your baseline, and engaging attacking aircraft. And that meant that for the aircraft engagement part, you did have to have a high elevation. You had to be able to track and elevate the gun relatively quickly in order to, lock onto aircraft and keep lock on them. That's why the Japanese 5-inch gun, as seen in the Fubuki class onwards, is theoretically a dual-purpose gun because it can elevate high enough to engage aircraft, but it's not particularly effective dual-purpose gun because it tracks and elevates relatively slowly. Its rate of fire isn't particularly brilliant either, which is a secondary issue. And actually that brings us on to rate of fire. If you're going to be engaging aircraft, that's usually a very sharp, fast engagement, so you want to be able to chuck shells downrange, relatively speaking, quickly, compared to something like, say, a 6-inch gun. But then all of that might mitigate towards a shorter barrel, faster weapon like the 5-inch 25 caliber. But this is where the other part of dual purpose comes in, because whilst we've explained all the things that you need to engage aircraft, to engage ships, you have to have a shell that is big enough that it's going to inflict meaningful damage on your target. As I say, the destroyer is the baseline. In the First World War, at least at the start, that would indicate a 4-inch gun. By the Second World War, you really are looking at 4.5-inch as the absolute minimum, and ideally 5-inch or maybe even slightly higher as better. I mean, kind of look at the armament destroyers are carrying to hurt each other, and then realise you need at least that or better. The 4-inch gun, yes, it is somewhat common on destroyers in World War I and maybe slightly thereafter, but by the time you get to the 1930s, you've got 4.5, 4.7, 5, 5.1 and higher guns on destroyers. So this is kind of the ballpark you need. Ideally, from a naval perspective, for capital ships, you want maybe just slightly bigger, slightly more powerful, because you want to outrange the destroyers, but that's not 100% necessary. And that shell has to fly out far enough and fast enough to have a meaningful engagement against enemy destroyers. Now, you might think, well, hang on, an anti-aircraft gun's got to fly out fairly far and fast to engage aircraft, therefore it should be fine against destroyers as well. But you've got to remember that if you're engaging aircraft with a heavy gun, because apart from the fact you're firing at a much higher angle, therefore the lateral distance traveled is going to be a lot less, but also in terms of just the ability to track an enemy aircraft to give you a decent firing solution, that is also a lot more limited compared to the surface solution. So your engagement distance is going to be shorter, at which point an anti-aircraft gun can actually get away with, relatively speaking, at least on a ship, a relatively low muzzle velocity, if that will allow it to do other things like chuck lots of shells out very quickly, hence the 5-inch 25. But, as was covered in the development of the 5-inch 38 caliber gun video that I did, when the 5-inch 25 was considered as destroyer-based armament, fire control advances suddenly meant that at the extreme edges of what destroyers were expected to engage, or even capital ships, in a surface action, the 5-inch 25 had too short a range and the shelf lifetime was too long. So they couldn't use it as a dual-purpose weapon. It became, stayed a anti-aircraft only really weapon. You could use it as an anti-surface role if you absolutely had to in an emergency, but it wasn't ideal. So that balance of we need to go relatively quick and reach relatively far, which necessitates a longer barrel, heavier weapon, versus we need to be able to traverse it and elevate it very quickly and shoot quite frequently, which would mitigate towards a shorter barrel weapon. This is the trade-off that everybody has to deal with when it comes to designing a dual-purpose weapon. And where exactly you rest along that line can potentially determine how effective your dual-purpose weapon is. But to be perfectly honest, the environment you end up in can also determine how effective a dual-purpose weapon that is. The 5-inch 38 rightly gets lauded as an extremely effective weapon in World War II. However, I would argue a part of that is the environment it is facing. The 5-inch 38 does get used in surface engagements quite a bit, most of which are at relatively close range, relatively speaking. But the majority of the threat that it faces is from the air, and because the 5-inch 38 is slightly biased towards the anti-air role, it obviously performs very well in that role and gets all the plaudits. Whereas you have various competitor weapons, particularly in the role of anti-aircraft guns fitted to battleships and fitted as the primary armament on small cruisers, the 5.25-inch that the British have. Now, that is sometimes derided, and to a certain extent, there is an element of truth in that derision, mostly due to the turret design, not so much due to the gun itself. But the 5.25-inch gun is also a dual-purpose weapon, but it is slightly more biased towards the anti-surface engagement side of things. And therefore, if you compare the 5.25-inch versus the 5-inch 38 for most of the war, outside of the very, very end of the war, once radar direct fire control allows it to exploit its longer range, but that's a different matter. But the bulk of the war, against the air threat, the 5-inch 38 does a lot better. But if you look at the Drydock class, for example, performing in the Mediterranean, the Didos are able to sit alongside the Arethuses and the Leanders and the Towns and so forth, and shoot at Italian vessels in a surface action because they're able to exploit the longer range of their weapons. Now, if you were to substitute a Dido with an Atlanta class, I think the Atlantas would actually find themselves outranged in quite a number of engagements where the Didos did not find themselves outranged. Now, does that mean the 5.25-inch is actually a more effective dual-purpose weapon than the 5.5-inch 38? No, not necessarily, because anti-surface engagements using dual-purpose weapons as a primary armament is a somewhat more niche environment in World War II, basically limited largely to the Mediterranean and a couple of night actions at Guadalcanal, as compared to being attacked by aircraft, which is kind of a universal problem for ships in World War II. So the 5-inch 38 still retains the top spot, but you have to always bear in mind that it still is contextual based on the environment that you are in. If by some magic hand aircraft prove to be spectacularly less effective in World War II than they turned out to be, and if perhaps engagements at short to medium ranges between small cruisers prove to be more common, like, I don't know, Didos versus Königsbergs or something like that, then the 5.25-inch probably would have got a lot more plaudits, barring the slightly dodgy turret design on the first generation, and the 5-inch 38 might not be as well known as it is today. Ryan Frederick asks, in the popular movie The Hunt for Red October, a Soviet nuclear submarine commander defects to the US with his officers and his ship. Obviously, this is the creation of the mind of Tom Clancy, but what are some historical instances of this sort of thing actually happening? Surely there's been a captain or two in history who simply turned coat and switched sides. Yeah, there have been quite a few examples of this over time. So currently pictured is HMS Aurora. She was sold post-World War II to the Chinese nationalist forces and became the Chungking, and then she defected to the Chinese communists. Well, her crew did, obviously, and took the ship with them. Then, if you go slightly back into World War II, there are a number of defections that occur, and you might think, well, hang on a minute, there weren't any Kriegsmarine ships that randomly decided to join up with the Royal Navy or Japanese ships that decided to join up with the US Navy or vice versa. But during the fall of France, obviously, you had the Vichy forces, which theoretically were neutral, but more and more over time closely aligned with the Germans, and the Free French forces who wanted nothing to do with it and set up their own separate government in exile and decided to continue fighting on the side of the Allies. And technically speaking, all French naval assets came under the control of Vichy France, and they sent out orders to that effect. But a number of Vichy French naval vessels heard about these orders and decided that they wanted nothing to do with them and promptly defected to the Free French, which, some of them were already in British ports. A good number of French naval vessels that were in British ports admittedly were seized, which isn't really defecting. But there were a number that in British ports that did just go, stuff this, we're still fighting the Germans. And as I said, a number at sea decided, well, we're going to keep on. For example, there was a French submarine that Admiral Cunningham noted in his autobiography that was out on patrol, received the Vichy orders, look, we're not fighting the Germans anymore, come back to port, stay away from the British. And the French commander went, I think not, gentlemen, and sailed into Malta and popped up. And everyone was like, oh, there's a French submarine in the middle of Malta Harbour. How did that get there? And he's like, hello, I'm here to join the Free French. Thanks very much. Which was, quite honourable of him. And as you go further and further back, you tend to find, situations like the fall of France are a little bit unique, because it's kind of a civil war, except not quite, because they're not directly fighting on home soil, but there are two separate governments both claiming to be in charge of the same area of land. But where you do get civil wars, obviously you get navies having to choose sides, and that usually involves some kind of split. The American Civil War, obviously a bunch of ships went over to the Confederate Navy, others stayed with the Union Navy. And as you wind it back even further, one of the other major reasons you'll see defections going on, very occasionally, especially back in the really ancient times, will be bribery. But also, even in the height of something like the Napoleonic Wars, you could find ships occasionally switching sides. So there were a small number of French ships at the start of the French Revolution who either saw or heard what was going on with revolutionary France, choppy, choppy, guillotine, guillotine, and went, yeah, no, I'm not part of this, doodles, and went over to Britain, because in those particular captains and crews' opinions, they may be British, but at least they're not going to decapitate us. But then during the war itself, you, believe it or not, did have occasional, very rare, but occasional defections, both from the French to the British and from the British back to the French, by various crews. And that was almost always inspired by a mutiny. For whatever reason. It could be very harsh treatment, it could be some other form of dissatisfaction, but basically if the crew got mutinous enough that they decided, that's it, we've had it with our officers, we're taking over the ship, they pretty much knew that if they came back to their home country after violently overthrowing, potentially with bloodshed, the command crew, they could be in a lot of trouble, up to and arbitrary execution levels of trouble. And the only place they were unlikely to get arbitrarily executed for murdering a bunch of senior officers of their navy, whether that be the Marine Nationale or the Royal Navy, was to go to the other side, because, the killing of French officers is not a crime in the Royal Navy, and the killing of British officers is not a crime in the Marine Nationale, outside of, specific set circumstances, like if they've already surrendered. So if you show up in a French port and you go, well, hi, we used to be HMS insert name here, and we've killed a bunch of the officers, imprisoned a bunch of the others, and we'd like to come and join the French Navy, they're just going to be like, result. We didn't even have to fight for that one, and vice versa. So you do get those kinds of things occurring as well as the simple, bribery and corruption. Another question that somebody asked, I don't know, maybe actually even further on in this Drydock, about what happened during the Glorious Revolution. That's technically speaking an entire naval service, the Royal Navy, just going, yeah, I think we're defecting over to the Dutch side. But there you go. Jellicoe Katz asks, in general, were aircraft on cruisers worth the price of admission in the opening stages of World War II? And if they were, how long was their shelf life? Would the US cruisers and the Solomons have been better off trading the float planes that didn't always work so well for torpedoes that didn't always work so well? Arguably, yes, they definitely were. Unless, of course, you get caught in a close-range night action and you have a bunch of aircraft amidships and they all get set on fire and there's a massive burning petrol fire amidships, then you probably really, really don't want them aboard. But in more general terms, 1939, 1940, even 1941, you see aircraft aboard cruisers actually doing pretty good work, scouting ahead to see what's going on out of sight in places like Norway. The Battle of the River Plate, there's an aircraft up there doing gunfire spotting, which is exactly what it was supposed to do. It's one of the many roles it's supposed to do. They're sometimes used for rescue and or recon on escort missions, and very occasionally in combat, again, like with the River Plate gunfire spotting, although that does tend to tail off relatively quickly. Of course, the Japanese got a reasonable amount of use out of scouting float planes, especially at night, with doing things like, well, locating various American forces during the Guadalcanal campaign, almost spotting for SED at one point, with a night-flying float planes, obviously, and so on and so forth. Where they stop being quite so useful is probably around 1942, 1943, which interestingly happens to coincide with when you start seeing them removed from a lot of ships, albeit it's not across the board. And the reason why they're removed generally is radar. Now, radar obviously has its own weight and power and space requirements, and in a lot of ways it's taking over a number of the roles that scout aircraft would be doing. General longish range recon beyond line of sight in night or with clouds and so forth, gunfire spotting and direction. Obviously, radar of World War II can't do the several 100-mile long-range recon that aircraft can do. They also can't do the pick up random people in the water that aircraft can do. So radar is not a complete panacea to replace aircraft, but it replaces aircraft in the bulk of the roles sufficient that most of the time the aircraft are being ditched in favour of the radar. But of course that relies on the radar being available and being relatively widespread, which is then why you don't see scout aircraft on cruisers disappearing quite so quickly in places like the Japanese Navy. They retain, and even with some things like Mogami, convert cruisers still further to support aircraft. So essentially, I would argue once radar becomes completely ubiquitous and very widespread amongst a navy, that's kind of when you start to see aircraft on cruisers disappearing for the most part, but it's not a complete disappearance depending on the cruiser in question. Some cruisers will retain aircraft even once they have radar because of those other things like long-range recon, long-range messengers, gunfire spotting on shore bombardment, picking up downed pilots and other survivors in the water, all these things that radar of the time can't do. That's what the aircraft be retained for, even if the number of retained aircraft is substantially less than you might have had originally. So, you look at a New Orleans class before the war, it might have 4 or more aircraft. A Town class might have 2 or 3. but maybe towards the end of the war they might only be carrying 1 or 2 aircraft. I mean, even USS Salem, which is of course a Des Moines-class cruiser and very heavily equipped with radar, still has an aircraft launching and handling and storage facilities aboard. Lieutenant William Bush asks, in your Battle of the Denmark Strait clips, you've mentioned the impressive performance of Prince Eugen's hydrophone system and its crew. I've heard the US Navy was similarly impressed with post-war tests. My question is, did other German surface ships use this gear? And if so, with any notable results? Did other navies have anything similar and or adopt the German system in post-war years? The answer is yes, the Germans did fit hydrophones on quite a lot of their surface fleet, and hydrophones were used in various other navies to various greater or lesser extents. When it comes to Allied ships, particularly obviously American and British ships, when you hear a ship is equipped with ASDIC or sonar, they effectively also have hydrophones, because a hydrophone at its core is an underwater microphone, an underwater listening device, and the receive part of an ASDIC or sonar set is essentially a hydrophone array, just obviously configured to specifically respond really well to these pings that or waves or signals or whatever else you get from the transmit portion. But obviously a hydrophone is a single entity, a single microphone, but the array that's fitted to Prince Eugen and the array fitted to most of the ships that use them is not just one, it's a whole, as the name implies, array of microphones. The same way, I mean, it's now all called passive sonar, but it's all the same thing. So the Prince Eugen system specifically was, I think, about 24 separate individual hydrophones that all coalesced into obviously one set of signals. And then when you look at the sonar or ASDIC fits on Allied warships, if you look in detail, you can figure out from that roughly how many individual hydrophones are in their array. Some Allied ships would have a separate hydrophone array from their sonar or ASDIC system, like this diagram shows. You've got it says destroyers fitted with hydrophones on the bow and stern. The bow unit is almost certainly going to be the one that's linked with the ASDIC or sonar system as one whole unit. The stern is almost certainly, outside of very few cases, going to be just a hydrophone array. But of course, it's not just the numbers of the hydrophones that you have aboard, it's also their direction, how they interface with each other, and the quality of them as well, because you could have 200 really rubbish hydrophones in an array and you probably still won't hear very much. You could have 24 really good quality hydrophones in an array and you'll hear really, really well, and everything else in between. Glenn Riccafrente asks, since the British 15-inch 42 caliber gun was so over-engineered, could they have been bored out to a larger caliber like those on the Italian battleships? And if so, how much larger could they have been? Could they have reached 16 inches? Would the QEs, Rs and the battle cruisers been more useful if their guns had been changed in this way? Could they have been bored out? Yes. I mean, as far as anyone can tell with the Italian guns, they basically took out the inner barrel lining and a little bit of the interior of the gun itself, the wire-wound portion, and popped a new slightly larger barrel lining in. Proportionally, obviously, a 15-inch gun barrel is going to have a slightly thicker liner, etc. So given that you could go from 12-inch to 12.6-inch with the Italian guns, 15-inch, could you bore it out to 16? I don't know exactly. I mean, heck, maybe at some point the Imperial War Museum will let me take a ladder up to the top of the two 15-inch guns they've got outside their main exhibit in Lambeth, and I can do some measurements. So I couldn't necessarily swear to definitively being able to bore out to 16 inches, but maybe, and probably you could get closer to it than the 12-inch could get to 12.6-inch. So exactly how large you could go, I don't know myself immediately, but you could have made them somewhat larger. Would they have been more useful if the guns had been changed in that way? I'm not sure, because one of the bigger limitations for a lot of the 15-inch armed ships was their limited elevation. And I think having a 15.5, 15.6, or even 16-inch gun that's limited to 20 degrees elevation is probably a lot less useful for the Royal Navy than having a 15-inch gun that can be that has been modified to reach 30 degrees of elevation, which Hood had originally, and obviously the Warspite, QE, and Valiant and Renown all had their turrets modified to allow for. So I think the elevation would have been the better option to change on all the other guns. The other element which would cause me to be a little bit hesitant is when you look at the Italian 12-inch, it was a 12-inch 46, it dropped down to approximately a 43, so it dropped about 3 calibers. It wasn't an exact number, but around about 3 calibers to get the 0.6-inch diameter. And with the 15-inch, you have to bear in mind that it's already something of a rush job, albeit a very effective rush job, on the 13-inch 45 caliber weapon, and that's created a 42 caliber weapon. So if we say, for sake of example, something you could fairly safely say that you can maybe make a 15.6-inch gun out of it, you'd now be dropping down to about a 39 caliber weapon. And if you were able to go up to 16 inches, I rather suspect you'd end up with something like a 16-inch 38 caliber weapon. At which point you would start to get a relative to the caliber barrel length that is short enough, you may be actually impinging on the performance of the slightly larger shell quite significantly by having such a relatively short barrel. That could be a problem, especially if you're trying for a long-range, hard-hitting gun. And, of course, you'd have to completely change all of the ammunition supply for the Royal Navy, manufacture shells to the new caliber, and, of course, especially if you get up to 16 inches, modify the ammunition handling systems and magazine storage as well. So, broadly speaking, I don't think the Royal Navy ships would be particularly well put if they were replacing their 15-inch 42s with some larger caliber bored-out version. I think if you're going to be modifying or replacing the Royal Navy's fleet of 15-inch guns, you either want to just be doing the elevation modifications up to 30 degrees, or, as I've mentioned before, if they actually carried forward the brand new 15-inch 45 caliber gun that was originally planned to go on the King George V's, if they developed that through to completion and perhaps even installed it on the King George V's instead of the 14-inch gun, then just flat out replacing the 1542 with those, ideally with elevation modifications as well, would be a much better way of going forward than boring out the existing guns. Sam Fisher asks, I read a remark online about the crew of HMCS Uganda on May 7th, 1944, deciding to vote itself to no longer continue the fight against the Japanese, effectively leaving the war. Can you give a bit of insight on this? How did the vote happen to begin with, and how did the British and Canadian Admiralty react to one of their ships just deciding, we're not doing this anymore? Well, it's a very complicated issue. Something that, there's almost as many opinions about exactly what happened and why as there were people on the ship. But if you collate all the different accounts and all the different explanations that have been given, and I have covered this briefly in other dry docks before, the sense that I get is that it's a whole combination of factors. Now, whilst obviously there were regular serving personnel in the Royal Canadian Navy prior to World War II, the Royal Canadian Navy was not a particularly large organisation at that point. So a good number of Canadian sailors had signed up because of the outbreak of World War II and it continuing on. But a very large number of those people who signed up had obviously not signed up to join the Royal Canadian Navy as a lifelong career. They had signed up for what was called hostilities-only postings, i.e. they agreed to join the Royal Canadian Navy, they would fight in the war, but then once the war was over, they would be released and allowed to go back home, which was all entirely reasonable. Unfortunately, at the time that those contracts had been signed, 39, 40, 41, the war was with Germany and sometimes Italy. Japan had not figured into this until the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, by which point a good chunk of Canadian service personnel who were going to sign up for the Royal Canadian Navy had already done so. And so, technically speaking, once the war in Europe came to an end, you could make the argument that their terms of service were also coming to an end. And the Canadian government, as a political organisation, had also voted to support Britain in its war against Germany. Japan had, in late 1941, kind of inserted itself into the general conflict via Pearl Harbor. But once it was clear the European war was winding up, this is where those wonderful people, the politicians, come in, because most of the crew of the Uganda were actually relatively okay with going out and fighting in the Pacific. They weren't particularly happy about some of the conditions on the ship itself, but there doesn't seem to have been any broad disaffection for the idea of fighting alongside the British and the Americans in the Pacific. It was just a broader part of the overall conflict that they were now part of. And actually, Uganda, during the time she was with the British specifically, did very well for herself. The Royal Navy was quite impressed with her. But then the Canadian government decided that for political reasons, they were going to say, okay, well, only Canadian service personnel who volunteer will be assigned to serve in the Pacific. And anyone who doesn't volunteer, who doesn't want to fight in the Pacific, doesn't have to. Now, in and of itself, this was not exactly the world's greatest vote of confidence in continuing the war against Japan, which wasn't appreciated very much by anybody else in the Allied cause. But that's political decisions for you. And then, of course, that word gets out to HMCS Uganda, and the crew now face something of a double whammy, because on the one hand, if they vote no, we don't want to actually keep fighting in the Pacific, that means we get to go home early, which means A, we get to see our families sooner, we are at less risk from all these kamikazes that are raining out of the sky like confetti, and, of course, the other thing, if you're thinking about long term, is that as the war in Europe ends, and a good chunk of the Royal Canadian Navy is made up of escort ships who are not going to be so needed off the coast of Japan, there's going to be an awful lot of people who are currently in the Navy and in the Royal Canadian Air Force and Army who are going to be going back to Canada and snapping up all the good jobs. So there's a lot of draws as to why you'd want to go back home to Canada. And, you've already volunteered to serve in the Navy, and now the government's going, well, are you sure? The underlying message of we don't really actually want to be committing forces to that area. And if you're risking life and limb in the face of kamikaze attacks, only to find that your government actually really couldn't be bothered to have you out there and would really rather not, that's going to be a bit of a morale hit, to say the least. But the idea that you're being sent into a situation and there's not really any political support for you back home, plus, as we said, the draws back home, plus the conditions, Uganda, like many British ships, not really having been designed for extended tropical service, and various other factors, it all adds up to the point that, a lot of the crew seem to have then, maybe they weren't initially thinking this before the message came through, but then once the message comes through and says, oh, well, you now all have to vote to see whether or not you're going to keep fighting, they sort of just went, well, okay, fine, if you're going to be like that, we won't. And 2/3 of them didn't. And so off they went back home. So if you want a really short version of it, a bunch of politicians decided that a country with the Pacific coastline had no business being involved in a conflict with a nation that wanted to dominate the Pacific, and then decided to cut the knees out from underneath all its service personnel by essentially telling them they didn't really care about them, they didn't want them out there, and reading between the lines, could they please just give up and come back home? And the men tended to respond accordingly to when they're essentially told, we don't support you anymore. Matt Blom asks, During World War II, several bases in the UK were set up for largely independent American Air Force operations, and that got me thinking. I don't recall hearing much about the naval side of American logistics in the UK. Was the US provided with certain naval bases to operate out of autonomously like the Air Force did, or otherwise how were American ships moored, resupplied and repaired in the UK? There weren't any major ports like Rosyth or Scapa turned over exclusively to the use of the US Navy. Here is USS Wasp, and she's sitting in Scapa Flow with a mixture of British and US ships. You can probably recognise just by the profiles in the background. So the US Navy just shared ports with the Royal Navy. But in terms of logistics, there are several levels of the logistics involved that you have to consider. At the lowest level, supplies like food and basic perishables could be had by just getting supplies from the UK or having US supply ships bring them out to the American ships if they needed that resupply. Another option, of course, was that the US ships would do a tour in the UK waters, and then they could head back to the US just across the Atlantic once their tour was up. Because, I mean, fuel is fuel. Fuel oil burns regardless of the source, so refueling the ship, for example, easily enough done. But then you have what I would tend to call mid-level supplies, because you've got things like, again, like Oerlikon ammunition, 40mm Bofors ammunition. This is stuff that the US and the UK are both using, so it's entirely possible to get resupplies for that kind of stuff. But then 5-inch ammunition, the UK does not manufacture ammunition for the 5-inch 38 caliber gun, or the particular shells that US cruisers would perhaps use for 6-inch or 8-inch, or the 16-inch ammunition for South Dakota class battleship or whatever. Now, these things could be brought out by US supply ships, and then the US supply ship would be docked up in a UK port that had US ships in it, and then depending on how the ship was set up, it could either just transfer the supplies straight over via cranes, or they could be unloaded, stored in a warehouse, and then transported over to another quayside for loading onto the US ship. So there would be runs of US logistical supply vessels to the UK for those kind of things, although again, some of those issues could be managed simply by the ship going home at the end of its tour. Although obviously you don't want to go home with no ammunition on board because you've expended it all, but you get the idea. Then you have the bigger issues. So, if a turbine goes, that's going to be a US manufactured turbine. It's going to have very different specs, shape, sizes, parts, etc. to a British turbine. Some of the radar, again, there's some common radar, but not necessarily all of it. And various other large ships' systems. Now, some of that could be repaired by the ship itself using its machine shop. Other parts could be repaired by getting onshore machine works to make stuff, because it might be effectively a custom piece anyway. But for the really, really big stuff, then that would have to be a case of go back to the States, and in the case of damage as well. If someone blows a hole in the side of the ship, British yards are just as capable of patching on a large sheet of steel as US yards are, but the internal damage, if various specific bespoke systems that are manufactured and used on US ships have been damaged or destroyed on a large scale by, say, a torpedo or a bomb, then again, it's going to be back to the US. So, essentially, you've got stuff where you can just use the British equivalent, stuff where the British are using the same systems as you, so they've got the same parts, stuff where the British don't use, but they can either manufacture a spare part or a close copy thereof relatively easily, and or things that you can get from US logistical ships that have been sent across. And then the upper level stuff, which is, either due to size or due to quantity, you just can't get those things over in the UK, and so you have to go back home. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, I recall recently seeing in various videos ships with draft marking measurements at the bow in Roman numerals, or with Arabic numerals, and some that don't have any at all, I noticed. Was there any particular standard practice regarding the presence or absence of draft markings, the number system used, and the unit of measurement? And if so, how did this vary over time or across nations? Unfortunately, it is a bit of a minefield, because the idea of draft markings came in the latter part of the mid-1800s, but as you closed in towards the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, there still wasn't a particular agreed standard. In fact, in 1890, there was a conference where it was pointed out that actually both Arabic and Roman numerals were being used in draft markings, although it was pointed out that the vast majority of ships were using Roman numerals at that point. And it was proposed that all draft markings in Arabic numerals should be in feet, and all markings in Roman numerals should be in metric, in tens of centimeters. And then there was this whole argument because a lot of people point out, well, A, we're mostly using Roman numerals already, and B, most of those are in feet, so that would require almost every ship on the planet to redo its draft markings. And so a convention was eventually established. It's not entirely clear whether it was established at the 1890 conference or at some point thereafter, that at least broadly, if the markings are in Roman numerals, that indicates the draft in feet, and if the markings are in Arabic numerals, then that indicates the draft in decimeters, i.e. tens of centimeters. But to complicate things, that is not necessarily followed by everybody, and further complicate things, sometimes ships carry multiple sets of draft markings, and sometimes they're not in the same numerals or the same set of measurements. So, if you're a British or an American ship for the time period the channel covers, you're almost certainly going to see Roman numerals describing the draft in feet, because that's the standard unit of measure that those ships and those countries are using at the time. Whereas if you look at a German ship, they are almost certainly, for the time period that the channel mostly covers, going to be using a metric system, same with the French. And so you would expect Arabic numerals to be more common amongst their vessels, although you do sometimes see German or French ships with Roman numerals, but in metric. And then you have this wonderful directive, which is from the Bureau of Construction and Repair in 1922, which says, for vessels of ordinary form, all draft marks will be in Arabic numerals, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of I, IV, etc., which is actually completely contrary to what most US ships at the time were using, but nonetheless. For vessels requiring an additional set of draft marks, the marks on the bow and the marks showing the maximum draft will be in Arabic numerals, but the marks on the stern will be in Roman numerals. So now you have both sets. These Roman numerals will be 3 inches in projected height, with horizontal marks placed between them. The lower edge of this mark should be placed at the 6-inch interval. All outside draft figures should be kept painted in a distinctive colour as required by Appendix 6, General Specifications, Instructions for Painting and Cementing Vessels. Which is entirely unhelpful because, as I said, not only does it mostly go against existing US practice at the time, but it also calls for both Roman and Arabic numerals to be present on ships. And it kind of goes on like this. So if you fast forward a little bit to 1948, you have yet another subtle variation, because the Bureau of Ships manual for that time says navigational draft marks in Arabic numerals, this is for US ships, are so located as to indicate operating drafts including projections, if any, below the keel of the vessel. These draft marks are 6 inches in vertical projected height and read at the bottom of the mark. So now you have Arabic markers in feet, not metric, but they measure from whatever is the absolute lowest point of the ship, not necessarily the keel. But then it goes on to say Roman numeral draft marks, when provided, always indicate the draft of the vessel measured from the bottom of the keel. And they are used for determining the displacement and other properties of the vessel in connection with the curves of form, not necessarily to do with navigation. And these are also in inches. So now you have 2 sets of numerals indicating 2 different drafts, potentially, used for 2 different purposes, one for navigation, one for displacement calculations, on a single type of vessel, a US ship, which is, of course, a slightly different variance on what the Bureau of Construction and Repair was saying a couple of decades beforehand, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So, yeah, good luck figuring it all out. Jim Smitty asks, I was listening to an old Bilge Pumps episode, and Dr. Clark briefly talks about an event in January 1939 when the Royal Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy decided it was a good idea to point guns at each other in an unnamed port in the Far East. Can you please give us some background on this event, and what caused both navies to decide it was a good idea to point large naval artillery at each other in what I'm assuming is a point-blank situation? Okay, this is a bit of a fun one. The background is the Japanese were throwing their weight around a lot more in the Western Pacific, partly just generally asserting themselves and partly also testing out to see who would, raise their hackles and, push back against these efforts. Bearing in mind the Sino-Japanese War 1939 season was going on at this point as well, so there was that added to the mix. Now, in the middle of all of this, 3 freighters, including one British vessel, the SS Vincent de Paul, had been detained on the high seas by Japanese heavy cruisers of the Miyako class, 3 of them, in fact, headed by the Ashigara. They had been encouraged at gunpoint to divert to the now Japanese, formerly German-held port of Qingdao, which I previously pronounced as Tsingtao, but is apparently Qingdao, so there you go. Anyway, that's where they were, and word of this seizure had reached the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had in the immediate area 1 cruiser, HMS Birmingham, which you can see here a couple of years before the incident, Town class, incidentally the only one without a bow knuckle, and 2 sloops. One of them, HMS Lowestoft, was sent off because she was frankly too slow for this. Neither sloop was particularly quick, but Lowestoft especially not particularly quick. Folkestone, however, was a little bit faster and so tagged along, with the 2-ship formation being limited to the speed of Folkestone. Folkestone and Birmingham then show up at Qingdao and basically do the naval equivalent of the classic British policeman, hello, what's all this then? Why are you nicking our ship? And the Japanese are sure and immediately start to pull this kind of weird double bluff of simultaneously insisting that no, they want nothing to do, they're not interested at all in taking the Vincent de Paul, it's all been some big misunderstanding, at which point Birmingham's captain's like, yes, okay, fair enough, then why is it in your port instead of on its normal trade route? Well, you see, that could be a little bit difficult to explain, but, well, there are some irregularities because its papers say it should have gone to this port in China, but we have photographic evidence that shows it was in this other port in China. And of course, the Japanese laying claim to China as a whole, and I guess maybe either want to accuse it of smuggling weapons or just not obeying Japanese authority or something like that. And so you have this thing of simultaneously saying they have no interest in it, but also it's violated all sorts of regulations and this needs to be investigated. And the captain of HMS Birmingham sees it for what it is, which is essentially trying to strong-arm people by forcing various nations' freighters to obey Japanese laws instead of their own nations and their host nations' laws on the high seas. And the captain of Birmingham decides that both for the honour of the Royal Navy and for the honour of Great Britain, the British Empire as a whole, this cannot stand. He basically thinks that this is completely unjustified, and since they have stated that they have no interest in the vessel, it will be leaving. Thank you very much. So the next morning, the boilers in Birmingham, Vincent de Paul and Folkestone are all warmed up and they're ready to go. And the Japanese are like, well, it would be very unfortunate if you were to try to leave. And the British response is, well, yes, if you say it will be very unfortunate for us to try to leave, well, if since it's not possible to communicate with the ports in question because none of them have a radio, so we'd have to send telegrams and everything, well, you know, if anything does happen whilst our little convoy is leaving, it will be entirely your own responsibility, which is 1930s diplomatic speak for, yeah, you just said a very dumb thing. You may wish to rethink saying that dumb thing before we take you seriously. Which was a huge bluff, of course, because you're 3 8-inch armed Miyako-class heavy cruisers versus a single Town class armed with 12 6-inch guns. But the captain of HMS Birmingham was entirely willing to see this through, so boilers were warmed up, the little convoy sails out with Folkestone leading the way, the freighter in the middle, and Birmingham guarding their backs. And you now have 38-inch guns trained at Birmingham, and Birmingham, plays it up by training individual turrets at the Japanese ships. And since they're at short range, the captain of Birmingham basically says, yeah, okay, A turret, you train on the bridge of that ship, B turret, train on the bridge of that ship, X turret, you get to train on the bridge of that ship, and Y turret, rejoice, for we have more turrets than we have targets, so have fun and pick your own. And Folkestone, gamely sitting up there with its little 4-inch deck gun, is helping by pointing its little deck gun at a Japanese ship as well, just in case that might help. At which point Birmingham is essentially, as the convoy sails past and the turrets are all tracking each other, Birmingham is essentially saying to the Japanese commanders, yes, you could kill me. Yes, after one or two salvos, my ship will probably be a floating wreck. Every single one of you captains who makes that decision is going to die first if you dare to make that decision. So go on, try me. Also, my torpedo launchers are armed. I'm pretty sure the Japanese ones were as well, just to add to the chaos. But, it's essentially a Mexican standoff, except it's a Mexican standoff between three people with, M2 Browning machine guns and a guy with, a bunch of Uzis, except he's holding one Uzi in each hand, another Uzi in his mouth, and has somehow contrived to aim a fourth Uzi with his foot, and is hopping gradually out of the way. The Japanese, however, presumably out of a sense of self-preservation, decide that perhaps today is not such a good day to die, and the convoy proceeds out into the open sea without any further incident. And everyone kind of just shakes themselves and pretends it never happened, because, of course, to imply that the Japanese and Royal Navies came within heartbeats of blowing each other out of the water in January 1939 would cause some diplomatic incidents that neither Britain nor the Japanese Empire were particularly willing to undertake at that stage, albeit, fast forward 3 years and things were a little bit different. Goose Riesbos asks, during the Glorious Revolution, aka that time the Dutch invaded England, William came over with 260 transport ships and 15,000 men. Where was the Royal Navy? Did they not like James II and just decide to sit it out? Were they busy with other stuff, or was there some other reason? It might seem odd considering that before he was king as Duke of York, James was actually quite popular with the Royal Navy as a pretty effective admiral, fighting, ironically enough, in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. But it should not go unmentioned that England, at this point in time, at the time of the Glorious Revolution, was a very strongly, one might even say fanatically, anti-Catholic country. The multiple attempts by Catholic Spain to invade and the massive discontent that occurred when Mary I had been on the throne probably didn't help with that perception, plus the fact that at this point the old enemy France was also Catholic, and the whole thing had kind of devolved into an us versus them mentality of epic religious and secular proportions. And James was pretty much confirmed by this point as James II as a Catholic. Some people didn't like this initially and wanted him out immediately. Others were willing to put up with it for as long as it took him to die and his daughters to take over, Mary and Anne. Mary, of course, being the wife of William of Orange, who was the one who would launch the Glorious Revolution, and the oldest daughter. And the majority seemed to be, okay, well, we'll just wait for him to toddle off and then we'll get back to being a good Protestant country again, on the basis that, without a male heir, that was what was going to happen sooner or later, and hopefully sooner. Then James's wife became pregnant, and there were plenty of rumours that it was going to be a boy, and as it turned out, yes, it was. This presented a bit of a problem because by the laws of the time, in fact, laws that only changed very recently, as in within a few years at the point of recording, it was the male heir, the oldest male heir, who would inherit the throne, not the oldest heir, which would immediately mean that this young boy, who presumably raised Catholic by his father, would succeed him, which was a problem for 95%-ish Protestant England. And so William decided to invade, partly for religious purposes, but mostly because a Catholic England looked like it was going to be allying itself with France, which the Netherlands was currently at war with. And an Anglo-French alliance would probably extinguish the Dutch Republic as an entity. Up until that point, obviously, the English and the Dutch had been cooperating against France and against Spain when they weren't shooting at each other. So over came William, and the reason I put all that background to it is because outside of a few hand-picked senior officers put in place by James, pretty much the rest of the Royal Navy was, like the rest of the population, strongly anti-Catholic and very, very Protestant. At which point, when they were told, as the Dutch propaganda said, that William was coming over to ensure that the Protestant religion remained prominent and that Mary, the Protestant princess, would have her succession rights maintained, regardless of what gender James's latest child was, that was kind of what most sailors and, to be honest, most officers and most people in the UK wanted. At which point, why would they stand in the way of what they wanted when standing in the way would get them shot at and also, ensure an outcome that they didn't want? Now, the commanding officers of the Royal Navy that was mostly based at Chatham at this stage, they did try to sail. I mean, they were given orders by James and they mostly had been put in place by handpicked by James, as I mentioned. But the Royal Navy at this point had been run down somewhat because both Charles II and James II had largely ruled by royal decree, so their funding for the Royal Navy after the Anglo-Dutch Wars had kind of fallen off a cliff. So the Royal Navy wasn't in the best of states. It didn't have the greatest number of ships operational. And when the men were told, yes, you must go out and sail and counteract this thing that you actually want to happen, they proved surprisingly lackadaisical about actually doing particularly much in terms of sailing. Plus, the wind was coming from the east heading west, which was great if you're trying to go from Antwerp to the UK, not so great if you're trying to get out of the Thames estuary. And so a small bedraggled collection of worn-out Royal Navy ships made half-hearted efforts at heading somewhere vaguely in the Dutch fleet's direction, but just so coincidentally never quite catching up close enough to force an engagement, which of course allowed William to land, and then we had the Glorious Revolution. And once that happened, the Royal Navy collectively just went, well, new boss says don't go after the other lot, because technically we're all now one fleet, so hurrah! No shooting, and everything worked out how we liked. So, yeah, they kind of almost sat it out whilst doing the minimum possible effort so they couldn't be accused of not quite obeying orders. Synchro Score asks, you've mentioned the development of supercharges to increase the range of the British 15-inch 42 caliber guns before, which meant they didn't need to alter the turret for greater elevation to get an increased range. How exactly did this work? Did they put more powerful propellant in charges of the existing size? Did they make the breech chamber larger to fit the bigger charges in? Or was the chamber of the original guns larger and spacers used with regular charges, like with other guns? They used the same cordite mixture that they were using with the standard charges. So the standard British cordite at this point was cordite SC. So cordite Mark I, cordite MD, and various other cordite were used in World War I, but World War II it's cordite SC. And that was measured with a number afterwards. The number told you in thousandths of an inch how thick each of the cords was, because if you've seen cordite, it comes in little sticks. So the standard charge that the 15-inch guns used was cordite SC280, so 280 thousandths of an inch in diameter, whereas the cordite used in the superchargers was cordite SC300, so 300 thousandths of an inch in diameter. So it was each stick of cordite was just that little bit thicker. And overall, this added up to the charge that was put together massing about 26 or so kilos more than the charge that was used as a standard charge, once you take into account the fact, obviously, there's multiple bagged charges, so each bag will only weigh a couple of kilos, 3-4 kilos more than the standard charge bags. There is a little bit of play in the diameter of charge bags versus the diameter of the breech. You just have to look at any number of museum ships where they've preserved the sort of a standing cordite train along with a shell, and you'll see that the diameter of the shell is actually a little bit larger than the diameter of the bags, but also any kind of spacing would also have been removed, because just making each cordite stick just that little bit thicker isn't going to add up to the overall weight change that's necessary. And so they're not making the breech chamber larger, because that would then invalidate the use of standard charges. That would make it very unstable to use standard charges. So it's essentially cramming as much explosive as the gun can safely take into the breech. And the reason for that is that no ship actually normally fires with its maximum possible charge, at least in World War I and World War II. So when you have guns and they're initially fired, you'll have what's called a proofing charge, which is significantly above what you're planning your standard charge to be. And the proofing charge is essentially the gun can, in theory, fire with this amount of explosive in it without exploding itself. Therefore, it's safe to use this smaller amount of explosive. But you do not want to be firing multiple proofing charges through a gun, because it is pushing it right to its performance limits. You'll then step it down by maybe 25% or so, give or take, depending on the type of weapon, and that will be your standard charge, because then that's a charge you can fire hundreds and hundreds of times without the stress either blowing up the gun, which is immediately a problem, and from a naval perspective also from wearing out the gun very quickly, which is a bureaucratic and treasury problem, because you then need to either reline or replace the gun. And somewhere in between the standard charge and the proofing charge is what the British would eventually settle on with the supercharge, and the supercharge was essentially how much explosive in addition to the standard charge can we fit in, which will not have particularly deleterious effects on the flight performance of the shell. We're prepared to accept the additional wear and tear this will cause on the guns for short periods of time, but obviously we don't want it to threaten to blow up the guns. So essentially the supercharge reflects the first step down from a proofing charge that you could reliably fire through the gun without it just detonating at random. And the standard charge is a step down further still, which is, okay, well, we could fire that much, but normally we won't, because that'll extend the service life of our gun barrels. Brian Smith asks, why was it the Japanese Navy seemed to place so much importance on using float planes as compared to other navies? I know other navies use them for recon, but the Japanese seem to have made just about a float plane version of almost every aircraft it ever had. Partly the fact that the Japanese were a little bit behind the Allies when it came to the development of all kinds of radar and the deployment also of these radars in mass numbers meant that they were forced to extend their efforts to, incorporate float planes into their arsenal for considerably longer, which meant that there was considerably more concerted development in terms of their scouting float plane aircraft park compared to the Allies, who, once they had radar, could kind of settle back on, well, this is kind of a good enough aircraft for their recon air float planes. Another factor was that the Japanese had slightly skewed experience thanks to the Sino-Japanese War, where the Chinese forces generally didn't exactly have the world's latest and greatest fighters, which meant that Japanese higher performance recon float planes could actually defend themselves pretty handily and even dogfight with quite a number of Chinese fighter craft, which led the Japanese to conclude that perhaps this should be an inherent property of recon float planes, the ability to go toe-to-toe with fighters, which of course yeah, if your enemy's using a generation behind technology for the most part, that might work. But if you're going up against a peer opponent, sticking a pair of heavy floats on the underside of your aircraft is automatically going to make you a less capable opponent. But there you go. And also, the Japanese tactical doctrine is exceptionally well aware of the fact that the Japanese Navy is the smaller navy, almost certainly, in any major war it's going to encounter. And that makes reconnaissance an absolute must for the Japanese. Now, that's not to say the Royal Navy or the US Navy were ignorant of what they needed to do when it came to reconnaissance and the fact they really actually liked knowing where the enemy were before going into attack. And obviously, if you don't, and the enemy does, that can be pretty disastrous. But ultimately, if you have the larger superior force, then knowing that the enemy is somewhere over there, i.e. you know they're coming, you can vaguely get ready for them, you go to action stations, and then when they show up wherever it happens to be in whatever strength you can deal with it, that is a position you can take as a superior force. If you are the inferior force numerically, then you absolutely have to know where your enemy is, because if you have that kind of meeting engagement where you're both vaguely aware of where that the other is in the area, then you're probably going to lose, because the enemy has more ships to lose. So all things being equal, they'll win. So as the small navy, you need to know exactly where the enemy is, exactly what they're doing, and therefore how to position your forces to those few scenarios where you have the advantage. And that means you need recon, you need lots of recon, and you need your recon aircraft to actually survive. And that means you need high performance recon aircraft. And as your enemy keeps advancing their recon aircraft and their fighters, that means you have to keep advancing your float planes to try and be at least survivable, if not better, than what your enemy might be putting up against them. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, based on the building yards available and the technology as of 1918, how large could a warship hypothetically get? Well, there's two parts to that answer. One part is how big a slipway can you get? Now, that is a slightly different matter because slipways can be extended. As you can see here with HMS Hood under construction, she's actually theoretically just a little too large for the slipway that she was built on, but by wedging the bow in between those two buildings that you can see there on the left and overhanging the road and light railway that services the dry dock, or the dockyard generally, they're able to make a go of it. And so, building a slipway large enough to take an arbitrarily large vessel is not so much of the problem, and worse comes to worse, you could do what the French did in the 1930s with Richelieu and build the central section of the ship and build a bit of the bow, a bit of the stern elsewhere, chuck the main section of the hull into the water and then attach the bow and stern separately. So you could get some truly monstrous ships down the slipways. The bigger problem was dry docks, because without dry docks, you can't maintain that ship. So it doesn't matter, you build a ship, great, fantastic. The minute it needs a significant refit, overhaul, or repair, it's out of service. And in terms of dry docks, in 1918-1919, the biggest dry docks in the world came in at just over 1,000 foot in length and between 140 and 150 foot wide for the absolute biggest. But you've got to bear in mind that doesn't necessarily reflect that you can build a ship that large, because if anyone's been to a dry dock, you'll know that most dry docks are not just rectangular boxes in the ground, they tend to step down. So just because you have a dry dock that's, say, 1,100 foot long, that doesn't mean you can fit an 1,100 foot ship in it once it's been drained. Your ship might have to be 30, 40, 50 or more feet shorter, which is why, for example, when the Tillman battleships were designed, admittedly that's just a little bit before 1918, but not too much, and it's asking what's the biggest battleship you could potentially ask for, the size of the hull was limited by the size of available dry docks, and the biggest Tillmans were 975 foot long and 108 foot wide. That 975 foot, basically they would need the 1,000 plus foot long dry docks, because you'd have 25 to 50 feet of empty space between the bow and the end of the dry dock. And likewise the beam, a 108 foot beam, but if it's stepping down, and obviously as we know ships tend to go at least amidships tend to go down fairly vertically before cutting across. That means you might have a dry dock that up top is 140, 150 foot wide, but down where the bottom of the hull is, again, it might come in 40 to 50 feet. So hence the maximum beam of the Tillman ships. And it's a similar issue with the Royal Navy. I mean, that's a US example, but a similar issue with the Royal Navy when they're looking at the design of the potential designs for the Admiral-class battle cruisers, and later on, just after 1918, when they're looking at the designs for the G3s. The problem isn't what they can build. You know, some of the designs for Hood were within a shouting distance of 900 foot long. Some of the designs for the G3s were even larger. Well, not the G3s themselves, but their predecessors within the alphanumeric designator series. The problem then was we've only got 2 or 3 dry docks that can actually fit these things, and they're mostly at home, so we have to scale things down a little, and even then, they're not going to fit in too many dry docks without extensions. So, broadly speaking, if you're talking absolute, what's the biggest dry dock we can use in 1918, you're pretty much looking at about a 970 to 1,000 foot long ship, depending on how curved the bow, how much of a clipper bow you've got, and about 100 to 115 foot in beam. Anything bigger than that, and you're going to have to start seriously reworking dry dock infrastructure. Now, you could do that. Technology of the time would allow you to build a ship that's even bigger than that, but you'd have to rework all your infrastructure. I mean, HMS Incomparable, Admiral Fisher sketches that during the First World War. It's 1,000 foot long and 104 foot in beam. There are dry docks capable of taking that ship in the UK, but 1, maybe 2. And now, granted, that is, okay, it's a couple of feet narrower, but 25 foot longer than a Tillman, and it's quote unquote only 46,000 tons, whereas the Tillman designs, well, the biggest of them was a lot more than that, 80,000 tons. But that's because partly the Tillman hull form is a lot more blocky because it's a battleship as opposed to HMS Incomparable, which is a battle cruiser, and also Incomparables carrying fewer guns and less armour. So if you want a 1,000 foot, 100,000 ton plus battleship, sure, you can do that in 1918. It'll fit in maybe 1 dock in the world, and that'll be about it. Blanched asks, is Operation Pedestal, the Malta naval resupply mission in World War II, considered a success or a failure? My understanding is that 55,000 tons of supplies were delivered, but 3 times as much was lost to German air and sea attacks, forcing the Allies to send more supplies within a few months. How important was the mission to the overall war in the Mediterranean, and was it worth the losses? Well, the first thing I think we need to note is it's not just the Germans. The Italians are putting in a lot of heavy lifting with the attacks on the Pedestal convoys, both from the air and attempted attacks from the sea as well. In terms of how important Pedestal is to the war effort, it's hugely important. Malta was about a month away from having to surrender due to lack of supplies at the time that Pedestal sailed. And if Malta surrendered, that would be a huge, huge problem for the Allies. Perhaps best evidenced by just how huge a problem Malta remained for the Axis because it stayed in service thanks to Pedestal. To give you some idea, Malta as an operational base for raiding Axis convoys heading from Italy down to North Africa was responsible for quite a lot of losses, which, Rommel and the Italians in Africa really could have used those supplies. Plus, of course, as long as Malta remained operational and an operational base, the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe kept having to try to bomb the place to stop it being operational, and that diverted aircraft to the bombing effort and also cost them aircraft in terms of aircraft shot down. And as well as a raiding base, Malta was also a signals base, a rest and resupply base for critically damaged vessels, etc., etc., etc. So keeping Malta in play was absolutely important. And was it worth the losses? Well, the Allies didn't try a big convoy like that again until after they'd got some more security in North Africa. They could put some more air cover up, etc., etc. So in the grand strategic terms, the losses were not sustainable, but in terms, and they definitely obviously were a lot more than they'd want to have suffered, but in terms of we have exchanged these vessels in exchange for keeping Malta in action, it's a painful pill to swallow, but it's worth. I think the losses were worth it, in as much as they fulfilled their objective. They certainly weren't pleasant losses. Eagle, obviously, you can see here sinking, a number of cruisers, one destroyer more damaged, and lots of merchant ships gone down. But at the end of the day, Malta had to be resupplied. This was the only way to resupply Malta, so the fact they accomplished their mission and most of the escorting fleet managed to survive overall is a plus, if not necessarily a positive, although I know that sounds slightly oxymoronic. But anyway, so broadly speaking, the mission would be considered a success, but an incredibly costly success. Almost, in some ways, almost a Pyrrhic victory, in as much as, they accomplished their mission, but they can't afford to win many more victories like that. Also, Pedestal and some of the other Malta convoys are really good to look up if you end up with people sounding off about how the Royal Navy was completely unprepared for mass air attacks in the Pacific, either in 1941-42 or in 44-45. It's a completely ridiculous statement to make, to be perfectly honest, and these kind of convoys show why. I mean, Vigorous, Harpoon, other good examples to look at. But since you asked about Pedestal, just if you look at Pedestal, over the course of several days, the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe threw over 600 aircraft, and these are land-based aircraft, which can carry significantly more deadly payloads on average than your average carrier-based aircraft. They threw that at this convoy, which, although it had a massively heavy escort for a convoy, is not a massive fleet in and of itself, compared to some of the forces the Royal Navy or the US Navy could come up with either at the time or shortly thereafter. And those aircraft generated well over 1,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe alone generated well over 600, let alone the Regia Aeronautica. And each one of those attacks was also very large. You look at Midway, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, etc., Eastern Solomons, where the US Navy is facing off against incoming Japanese fighters and bombers and, dive bombers, torpedo bombers. And the actual attack waves themselves individually, you're talking about a dozen, 2 dozen aircraft, strike aircraft per attack wave. When you're looking at the Pedestal convoys, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 dozen plus strike aircraft with fighter escort per attack wave, and there's multiple attack waves per day, and there's several days of the operation, each of which are containing these multiple attack waves. The British had a pretty good idea what it was like to be under mass sustained air strikes with relatively minimal air cover. And it cost them, and they did suffer under Japanese air attack in 1941-42, but to be fair, no one in the Western Pacific had anything even close to the number of ships that Pedestal had in 1941-42. I dare say if the Operation Pedestal escort force had been transplanted into the place of Force Z or Abda or any of those other forces, Marblehead, Boise, etc., Houston, that got horribly victimized by the Japanese in late 41 and early 42, it almost certainly, in fact, I'd say pretty much guaranteed, would have done immeasurably better than any of those forces, partly because the Pedestal escort force outnumbered ABDA command in form of actual effective combat units for a good chunk of its existence. W. Swordsman asks, what was the planned distribution of the Royal Navy in late 1945, early 1946 if Japan had not surrendered? How much would be left at home or throughout the Empire when there were no threats worth noting? Well, it will be somewhat speculative because whilst there are Royal Navy operational plans for how they were going to support the US in an invasion of Japan, They are, of course, somewhat speculative because you don't know which ships are going to be damaged and have to return home in that intervening period, and which ships are actually going to be commissioned or recommissioned and then sent out during that period, because, of course, with the war winding down after the atomic bombs, everything slows down. So, for example, HMS Vanguard was commissioned in 1946, probably, well, in the historical timeline, would not have made it out, but if the war had continued through the latter part of 1945, and it was clear that it was going to continue into 46, there would have been a bit more urgency to get Vanguard ready, and potentially Vanguard would have been out there. Similarly, Renown was brought in early 45 for a refit to upgrade her, even though she had been modernized just before the war, but she was going to be re-modernized. And then with the end of the war, that was cancelled. If that hadn't gone on, then she probably would have been refitted. Well, she almost certainly would have been refitted and then sent out to the Pacific as well. Exactly when she would arrive, again, who knows? Then you've got, well, the Royal Navy has pretty much deployed almost all of its fleet carrier strength already, but you'll have various of the light fleet carrier program coming online, and they might, some of them are already out there, but others will be coming online, so they'll be heading out there. Various cruisers also in refit. HMS Belfast, for example, is in refit, ready to go out to the Pacific, and is actually heading out to the Pacific just around about the time the war ends historically, so she would have been out there. Battle-class destroyers are coming down the line. They're all just a little bit too late, but in this they wouldn't have been, and so on and so forth. At the same time, obviously, economically, Britain would have been decommissioning rafts of older ships, so, early interwar destroyers. I think pretty much anything that's prior to a tribal would be seriously looked at as on the chopping block, given how many wartime destroyers they've got at this stage. Some of the older, more beat-up cruisers will also be going. Rodney's already in deep reserve. Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, well, Valiant maybe is a bit too broken, but Queen Elizabeth, it will probably be sent back out again. Warspite, like Valiant, is probably a little bit too broken to send back out again in 46. The R-class and Malaya, they're just not going out there. Nelson's already been sent out. The King George V's are there. Lots more submarines would almost certainly go out. I suspect, with the Germans and the Italians dealt with the war over, there would be relatively minimal forces kept in Britain. Certainly that's what the plan seemed to indicate, because Churchill was trying, as part of his effort with the British Pacific Fleet, to reassert the idea that the British Empire was there as an equal partner with the US Navy. The British Pacific Fleet might not exceed the strength of the US Navy in the Western Pacific, but they wanted to give as good a shot at it as they possibly could. And, they probably would have tried to sustain that with, obviously, some Canadian ships, Royal Australian Navy, etc., all being out there as well. So, yeah, broadly speaking, you would have seen the bulk of the operational strength of the Royal Navy out in the Western Pacific. Although, if Japan is encircled, blockaded, locked down prior to the invasion, you might not have seen every single British ship in the Western Pacific in the British Pacific Fleet on the front line, obviously apart from the ones that are going through rest refit cycles nearby, but you probably would have seen quite a number of vessels being used to capture or support operations against various British possessions that the Japanese had taken, which they'd now be in the process of retaking. And I think older ships would be sort of place-holding on imperial policing stations until the major effort against Japan had been decided upon. Gregory Albert asks, what would have been the most realistic worst-case scenario for the Americans at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, both for them losing and still somehow winning, but with significantly more losses than the real battle? Okay, this took some thinking. But in terms of realistic worst case for the Americans, the most realistic worst case I could come up with was still somewhat unrealistic, because it involves Admiral Lee making a mistake, which, as you know from the video on Admiral Lee, yeah, that ain't gonna happen most likely. But Admiral Lee was still in a subordinate position, so perhaps it's not even necessarily him making a mistake. It could just be him not having quite as good a working relationship with the admirals in charge, like Mitchell, that he historically did. So, in our alternate scenario, in the prelude, we're going to basically change two things. One is that either through Japanese anti-sub efforts, which is perhaps more unrealistic, or through just wind and random chance and the weather, which is perhaps more realistic, we're going to assume that US submarines do not sink Taiho and Shikaku on the 19th. So that's going to be one thing. So it gives the Japanese a bit more air power to play with. And we're combining that with changing the US Navy, going, there's a good chance we might run into the Japanese forces at night. Lee, do you want to take your battleships forward and fight them? And then Lee saying, no, that's a terrible idea when we have so many aircraft carriers. Let's just hit them at long range. We're going to change that to the higher-ups in the US Navy saying, we're most likely going to run into the Japanese forces at night. Admiral Lee, you are ordered to take your battleships and escorts forward to engage them. And this is where things are going to start to go slightly skew-if, because Admiral Lee is now directly ordered to do so. If he makes any objections, they're going to be overruled. So, okay, fine. I'm going. Off he goes. Does his best, obviously, as being Admiral Lee, he would. But overnight, the previous day, the Japanese get some indication, maybe through a lucky submarine sighting or float plane or whatever, that the American battleships are coming forward. Fantastic. The Japanese have Nagato, although she's in a slightly different formation, but they have Yamato, Musashi, and 2 Kongos. Granted, they are slightly outnumbered by the Americans, but hey, Yamatos. The Japanese decide, all right, we're going to reenact Kantai Kessin in miniature, and we're going to send in a swarm of our destroyers and cruisers to attack the American battleships first. And obviously, the Americans do have a radar advantage in this case, but with so many torpedoes in the water, including Shimakaze having fun, the American forces move forward. As Admiral Lee correctly pointed out in the historic timeline, his forces are not particularly trained for this kind of night engagement at this point. So there's a series of communications, foul-ups, and before they know it, the Americans realize that the Japanese torpedo attack from the destroyers and cruisers is bearing down on them around about the same point that the Japanese are almost at their release points. Massive gunfire erupts, long lances in the water all over the place. The Japanese forces, probably realistically, once the Americans have gotten their act together, switched on their radars and started opening fire, are going to get a bit of a kicking. But there's enough torpedoes in the water. Multiple American ships are taking torpedo hits. Several American battleships are taking torpedo hits. Potentially 1 or 2 are crippled. Maybe one's really unlucky and catches a brace of 4 or 5 and sunk, but let's just say there's a few of them are badly damaged or crippled. And then as the dawn begins to rise and communications getting back to the US fleet, everything's gone badly wrong, please send help. So the US carriers are warming up their aircraft to give the American battleship formation air cover as it tries to limp back. But then out of the darkness comes the Japanese capital ships, the Yamatos, Kongos, and any survivors of the night attack who want another go, plus the escorts for the battleships. And now there's a pre-dawn surface action. Now the US still have quite a lot of battleships, but a number of them are slowed and badly damaged, so that reduces their advantage. And as I said, the Yamatos are the Yamatos. The Kongos, to be fair, are probably acting as XP pinatas for some of the surviving American ships, but they're able to put some rounds downrange, which will cause some damage. But the Yamatos are able to execute quite a significant amount of destruction on the assembled American fast battleships. It's probably still not going to go particularly brilliantly for the Yamatos, though. They've got good fire control. They're able to take advantage of pretty much everything the Japanese want, but they are still outnumbered. There's a lot of 16-inch guns firing Mark 8 Super Heavies at them. And as dawn comes, as the light gets brighter, and obviously as the radar-directed gunnery control starts to kick in, they're going to take a bit of a pounding. But having obviously prepared all this all through the night, they have also been communicating with their own forces and planning a airstrike in the morning to support them. And since the Japanese were slightly quicker off the bat in terms of communicating and preparing it. Once dawn comes, it's their airstrike that gets in first. So big Japanese airstrike comes in. The American ships are now very, very battered. Probably a few of them are sunk or sinking. Mass Japanese torpedo and dive bomber attacks come in. Let's face it, the Japanese dive bombers are not really going to do all that much even to a damaged American battleship. But the torpedo bombers, on the other hand, are a bit of a problem, especially considering a lot of the anti-aircraft guns on the American ships will have been damaged or destroyed, or their crews killed in the night and pre-dawn actions, at which point the American battleships are now losing even more ships, and others that perhaps are not quite as badly damaged are getting more badly damaged. The Japanese surface vessels are withdrawing because they know there's a counterpunch coming. The Japanese know there's a counterpunch coming, so as the Japanese aircraft withdraw, then suddenly here comes the American strike waves. They're all diving down, trying to finish off and drive off the last Japanese surface ships and hopefully take down any survivors, if Yamato and Musashi are badly damaged and trailing or whatever. But the Japanese, having got there first, whilst the Americans are kind of obsessed on, they're seeing the Japanese strike aircraft retreating, they've seen the Japanese ships retreating, they're all going after the Japanese ships. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol comes down from on high, gets the jump. Probably still not going to last tremendously long. The Americans have a lot of fighters themselves, but they're initially getting the jump, disrupt the American air attack, cost them a lot of aircraft. The Japanese fighters, as I said, probably get cut to pieces anyway, but the Japanese strike elements probably get home. They start refueling and rearming, and then early morning, while the Americans are still recovering the survivors of this air attack, which obviously will have come home a little bit later than the Japanese, then in come the Japanese strike aircraft, probably with a minimal fighter escort, trying desperately to knock out the American carrier aircraft, because, hey, it's gone kind of okay for them so far. And they damage some carriers, maybe sink an Independence class or two, whilst the airborne Combat Air Patrol absolutely shreds them, and the anti-aircraft fire shreds them, but with a lot of American fighters either shot down, damaged, or in the process trying to land and refuel, there's not quite enough air resistance to prevent those damages and losses. And then that's when things start to go badly for the Japanese, because basically they've shot their load. So their battleship force is essentially crippled and sinking. They won't have been able to put down the American carrier force, but now the American carrier force can get some of those spare aircraft down from the hangars, repair aircraft that can be repaired, reorganize the squadrons, and now they're out for blood, and the Japanese carriers basically get midwayed, or worse, by the counterpunch from the US come about noon or early afternoon. But it's cost the Americans a few carriers damaged, let's say maybe a light carrier sunk, and the fast battleship force, the South Dakotas, the North Carolinas, and the Iowas, has been very, very badly mauled, with several ships lost, others very badly damaged, possibly going down later on. And, it's not a good day to be an American surface vessel. But it's a worse day to be in a Japanese vessel, because they're going to suffer very, very extensive casualties in exchange. That's about the most, not necessarily realistic, but probably the closest to realistic, everything that could reasonably go wrong for the Americans does go wrong scenario for the Philippine Sea. Andrew Dedera asks, the 19th century seems to have been a race to build ever bigger guns, with rate of fire and accuracy trailing well behind. Was this driven by a lack of proper proof, i.e. not enough fights, and were there any navies that didn't go down this path? Well, the absolute large and absurd guns, they're actually in a relative minority of navies, but that's largely because the big navies that we would associate with being the major navies during the main period the channel covers weren't actually really around, at least in battleship terms, during the period where the massive guns really come in. So, for example, HMS Benbow, with colossally stupidly large single guns fore and aft. These ships all come about in essentially the first part of the 1880s, because armour technology, we've gone from iron to compound at this stage, is advancing to the point where the sheer thickness of compound armour, and in some cases just sheer iron, is enough that even at relatively close ranges, because bear in mind there's no rangefinders or fire control at this point, it's questionable as to whether the big guns that are currently being carried, which is usually 12-inch or some variation thereof, can actually penetrate that armour. And since those guns still have a rate of fire that's described in minutes per round, why not go for an even bigger gun? Because accuracy is low and rate of fire is low, so a single larger weapon fore and aft, or in the case of the Victoria class, 2 such weapons forward, its accuracy and rate of fire is not going to be that much less than any of the others, but it stands a much better chance of punching through some of the thickest armour, and when it does, the shell is obviously larger, contains more explosive, it's going to do more damage, and so the logic goes it's better to have fewer, even larger guns than smaller, more numerous guns, which aren't going to fire all that much faster and may well be deflected or stopped by the relevant armour. But at the time, you've got the Italians building battleships, you've got the British building battleships, but the Americans are in the middle of one of their semi-regular 19th century funding starvation period, so they're not building any battleships. The French are playing around with the Je ne Colle, so they're not building any battleships. The Spanish are far too small a power at this point to be thinking about building top-of-the-line battleships. The Germans have only just become Germany and are building coastal defense ships. And the Russians are also not particularly interested in building full-scale ocean-going battleships at this point and are mainly building Baltic and Black Sea operations only focused vessels, which are going for slightly more numerous, smaller guns for their own purposes, because they're mostly thinking about having to fight much, much smaller vessels, and also they're not building ships quite as rapidly, so their design ideas are perhaps from the late 1870s. So in actual fact, in terms of navies that don't go down the path of 16.5 or 17.7 inch guns, that's actually most of them, because it's a very short-lived fad of maybe 5 or 6 years, and then in the aftermath of that you get the gradual improvements in metallurgy and propellant that lead to everybody reducing the caliber of the guns, because suddenly 11-inch, 12-inch, 13-inch guns and subvariants thereof now have the capability of punching through the heaviest armour, and then you get the rate of fire also increasing on them, and then new armour comes in, and you then wind up with pre-dreadnoughts. Nathapon Hongsheron asks, in Nassau's 5-minute guide and in Admiral Beresford versus the 2nd Pacific Squadron, you mentioned that some battleships' guns needed to be in a certain position to be able to load. Could you elaborate on this? For example, do they have to be just at 0 degrees elevation for the bad ones, but better ones can load at 10 plus 10 degrees? Or do the bad ones need to train the whole turret to a rest position to load, or what? There's essentially 3, actually maybe 4 stages to this. So there is, at the first stage, the gun that after every shot must return to a specific position, usually on the centre line, to reload. This is usually because the rammer, which puts the shell and the charges home, is in a fixed position that doesn't rotate with the barbette or the turret, depending on the era of the ship. And so in that case, regardless of anything else, if the thing that shoves the shells in is in a fixed location, that gun always has to return to that fixed location in order to reload. Then, for example, with the Majestic class as a good crossover point, hence why Majestic is on screen at the moment, you have sort of the crossing over point of both Stage 2 and Stage 3. So Stage 2, the rammers are taken within the rotating mechanism. So the Majestic class could technically reload with at any point during the turret's rotation, whether it's broadside on, fore and aft, whatever. But that assumes that you have ammunition in the turret to actually load, because on the earlier Majestics, the hoists for the shells and the charges did not rotate with the turret. So in order for the hoists to line up, the gaps in the floor of the gun house to line up with the hoist further down, the turrets had to be returned to a central position. So if you had, let's say, half a dozen rounds, you could fire 3 salvos from your twin turret on a Majestic, at least an early model Majestic. But then when you needed to do your 4th salvo, you needed to bring up more shells. Now the turret has to go back to the fore and aft position to bring up more ammunition. And then in the later Majestics, the last few, you have a system whereby you can, because the turrets go from pear-shaped to circular, you now have a rotating shell hoist. So now the shells can come up when the turret's rotated at any angle. And the rammers, obviously, are already on board. Therefore, you can load with the turret at any angle at any time, regardless of how many rounds you've already fired. So that's great. But then we enter the 4th stage, which is at what elevation can the guns reload? And some guns have to go back to a 0-degree elevation because the hydraulic rammers, although they might be fixed within the rotating mass of the turret, they may themselves be fixed in a horizontal plane. So they can only go 0 degrees horizontal, which means you elevate the guns to 15 degrees, you fire, great, but they have to come back down to 0 to reload. There's then an intermediate stage, which is what you'll find on most dreadnoughts, which is that they can load up to a certain angle. And that will be for 2 reasons. Obviously, the hydraulic rammers are now part of the overall elevation mechanism. They're not directly linked necessarily, although in some cases they are. But they now have pits that they can descend into as the gun elevates, or potentially they may still be fixed and they may have flexible rods, which look more like giant chains. Again, it depends on exactly which ship is using what technology. But these allow you to load your gun at an angle that's not just 0 degrees. So it might be up to 5 degrees, it might be up to 10 degrees, it might be up to 15 degrees, depending on your ship. But, if you fired at 25 degrees, because you're firing at long range, you're still going to have to drop the gun down to a certain level. And the other limitation is how powerful the hydraulic rammers are, because if you're loading a shell that weighs 1,000 or 2,000 or more pounds, and then a bunch of explosive afterwards, to push that all along horizontally on what ultimately still going to be an ungreased surface, even if it's very smooth, takes a certain amount of energy. To push that uphill at 15 degrees takes a lot more energy, and your hydraulic rams may not be up to that, and you could expand them and make them more powerful, but that's going to make everything heavier and larger, and you might not want to do that. And then the final iteration is what they call all-angle loading, which is much easier to do on smaller guns. On battleships, there are very, very, very few battleships that have all-angle loading, which is that whatever elevation the gun's at, they can reload at that angle, which allows you to maintain the guns pointed at the target at all times without the slightest deviation whilst you reload. But most ships that theoretically have that capability, like the Richelieu's, even they tend to prefer to lower the guns at least somewhat, because, again, whilst their hydraulic motors for the rammers might be capable of loading at such a high angle, you generally find the rate of loading tends to slow down because they're approaching their limits. So there's a whole series of graduations involved there. DM Phoenix asks, when a typical warship, including submarines, are on station in an assigned area, what is it doing movement-wise? Is it anchored to a fixed point, or are the engines off, leaving it adrift in a roughly general area, or running in circles at low speed in a loitering pattern? It depends what they're doing in terms of peace or war, because a wartime on station, the ship will generally have some very specific stated objectives. So your on station might be escorting this carrier group, or escorting this convoy, or something similar, or attacking this position, in which case you'll be sailing with a bunch of other ships in formation, going from point A to point B, or sailing offshore and shooting at things on shore. If you're assigned to patrol an area looking for a potential target or guarding against potential targets, so anti-submarine patrol, anti-merchant raider patrol, then there'll obviously be something you're trying to defend, something you're trying to prevent these things getting to, and a theoretical direction from which you think the enemy might be coming from, and you'll be manning some kind of patrol route, back and forth, zigzags, whatever you think is going to be the most effective, or potentially what you've been ordered to do, to keep an eye on a potential approach by an enemy vessel. If you're hunting, so you might be hunting for enemy merchant raiders, you might be the merchant raider or surface raider hunting for merchants, you might be a submarine going after merchants, etc., then you will be receiving intel saying, well, in your area, in your defined area of operations, which is your on-station area, then, we think there may be enemy targets roughly over here. Or you be allowed to use your own initiative. So you might, especially if you're raiding, go, okay, well, here is my broad operational area, which I'm now on station within. But I know that this port, for example, has a lot of factories that need a lot of raw materials. And these ports supply these raw materials to the ones that are needed for the factories in Port A. Therefore, it is likely that the enemy will run convoys from, or have supply ships running from these other ports to Port A, and those are likely to follow the following routes, either based on intel, based on pre-war knowledge, or based on observations from other ships. And so you might go, right, I'm going to patrol up and down this route, see if I can find anything, and then if I don't, I'm going to go patrol this route, see if I can find anything. Basically patrolling the merchant lanes for shipping. Or, as you might be told, we've spotted an enemy over here. Go and try and kill them. So what exactly you might be doing during wartime on station can vary an awful lot. You are not going to be just sitting there basically at anchor. Unless, of course, you're in one of the very, very few situations where that might be the case, if you're acting as a reference marker, navigational marker, or something like that. Or, in the case of some of the later US destroyers, manually checking overhead US aircraft streams to make sure that none of them is a Japanese aircraft cosplaying as a US fighter. In peacetime, on station, like you see here, HMS Cornwall on the China station, will usually consist of port visits to show the flag and encourage everybody that, you're here, you're making sure everything is safe, and then you'll go and journey to another port and repeat the process over and over, with occasional excursions to do exercises at sea. But it's essentially like a heavily armed cruise liner set of visits, with a bit more discipline. Elliot W. James asks, reading Brassey's Naval Annual 1899 and H.W. Wilson's Downfall of Spain 1900, I find the Americans introduced condensing ships as fleet auxiliaries. The vessels involved were Iris at 6,200 tons, Niagara 5,220 tons, and Rainbow 6,200 tons. Brassey specifically notes the cruiser New York was self-supplying using their own condenser. The Russian 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons didn't seem to employ them in their auxiliaries, and I can find no references to specialist condensing ships in either the Royal Navy or the Marine Nationale. So what was a condensing ship, and what particular problems did the US encounter that required these vessels in 1898? Well, here's USS Niagara. Now, the US faced two related problems, one minor, one major, which is why you have these condensing ships specifically showing up in the Spanish-American War. The minor one is that whilst the US is just about in the process of getting a proper ocean-going fleet running, a number of the ships they're using in the Spanish-American War are either requisitioned, or they are older vessels that were really not designed for anything more than coastal defence. And as a result, a ship that's designed for coastal defence, or just generally is not designed for particularly long periods out at sea, would normally rely on its own onboard water supplies. And if they had any condensing ability, i.e. what we would call water distillation, the ability to make their own fresh water, it would be a relatively limited amount, not enough to keep up with crew demand. And so some ships in the US fleet did require top-ups of fresh water. As you mentioned, the cruiser New York was self-supplying, as were pretty much most long-distance ocean-going vessels, especially ocean-going warships. But as we just said, not every ship on station for the US Navy was one of those. The other factor was the fact that there was land warfare going on, which the US Navy was acting in support of, and the troops ashore obviously could not necessarily guarantee to find supplies of fresh water themselves, and therefore it was held that the best way to supply them with fresh water to stop them getting all sorts of weird and wonderful tropical diseases, which historically have killed a lot more troops in the Caribbean region than actual conflict has, is to have condensing ships, which, as the name suggests, basically their purpose, at least at that point in their lives, is to generate large amounts of fresh water from the local seawater, and then that fresh water can be taken ashore for use by the men ashore, which is quite nice, I suppose. Ferrata Victrix asks, what would be your choices for the 7 deadly sins of naval warfare, and what about the 7 heavenly virtues of the same? Well, I think each one is probably a two-sided coin, so the negative would be one thing, and then the positive would be the inverse of that, or vice versa, depending on how optimistic you are, but nonetheless. And some of it will stray a little bit, unfortunately, into politics, because there is the saying, war is the continuation of politics by other means, and naval warfare, the strategic level, does involve certain political decisions. So, in no particular order, I would say one of the most deadly sins is assuming that your enemy is inferior to you. Now, this doesn't mean that you're assuming that your enemy might have fewer ships than you, because they might. That might be an accurate assessment. What I'm referring to is the idea that your enemy is inherently in some way inferior to you, one-to-one. Now, ship versus ship, man for man, somehow they are lesser. You do see this assumption cropping up from time to time in various assumptions and in various navies at various points, and almost universally the people who make those assumptions, or the people that they've given those assumptions to, get a very, very rude awakening, usually an explosive one, because as it turns out, the idea that just because these people are from another race or another nation, they must therefore be thick as 2 short planks compared to your glorious, upstanding master nation, is a load of complete nonsense, and you usually suffer for that, because if you expect your enemy to be worse than you, well, at best you're right, and you don't really gain much, and middle case and worst case, you're horribly wrong and they win, or they inflict massive losses on you that you really shouldn't have suffered. And you are usually going to be wrong. I mean, there's a few exceptions, like, the Napoleonic Wars, immediate post-execution of most of the officer French Navy, but it takes something as drastic as the French Revolution to create something where you can reliably say, yeah, those guys are probably not as good as we are. Another one would be assuming that you can fight a war when you choose. The war of choice, the idea that there will not be a war until we deem ourselves ready for it, or until we decide we want one, is something that's recurred time and time again, and pretty much every time it has bit people in the backside. So much as the corollary for the previous one is assume your enemy is at least as good as you are, the corollary for this one would be assume that someone may declare war on you tomorrow, next month, next year, insert as applicable depending on your exact time period, but no more than a year ahead of time, i.e., always be prepared and don't assume that you're going to get a choice of when war breaks out. Another one would be do not overreach with the forces that you have, because you might have forces capable of pulling off a spectacular victory, pulling off a particularly successful campaign, but then you're going to need to rest, refit, cycle out ships, and perhaps you are reaching boundaries of what you can do. So the corollary being, have a realistic idea of what your limits are. Because, again, the fields of naval history are littered with examples of ships, squadrons, flotillas, formations, fleets that started off well, maybe did really well in the first few campaigns, the first few battles, first few operations, whatever, and then they got overconfident, pushed too far, and got the door rather firmly slammed in their face. I think then we would have as another sin sticking to the plan because it is the plan, and the corollary being adaptable and flexible as the situation demands it. Again, lots of ships and admirals have gone to grief because the plan said they were going to do this, Usually it's the personal plan of the person in charge. And maybe it was a good plan to start with, but as the situation developed and became clear it was not maybe such a good plan, they've kept going with the plan because it's the plan. And the plan is, the holy thing, and we must always follow the plan. Meanwhile, the slightly more adaptable people all around them have changed their plans and come up with counters to what the enemy who's following the plan is doing, and just turned around and eviscerated them. Whereas, obviously, if you adapt on the fly, improvise and overcome, as they say, recognizing when a plan is no longer really viable, then you are going to succeed a lot more often. Then, as another sin, I would have indecision, and the corollary being confidence. Of course, too much of anything can be bad, so you don't want to be overconfident, but if you have confident leadership and you follow through on your decisions, and then if something changes, you look at it, you make a decision, and then you go with your new decision, and you constantly lead with confidence, it's rare that you're going to come a cropper. Indecision, back and forthing, etc., not only affects the morale of your men, but usually leads to very, very poor overall decisions being made, as well as giving the enemy plenty of time to just keep shooting at you whilst you're trying to make up your mind. And then my penultimate pairing would be, in terms of the sin, thinking that the officer-enlisted divide is actually a thing. And the corollary would be looking after your men. Because, yes, there is an administrative divide between officers and the enlisted. However, you're all still human, and there's a lot more of them than there are of you if you're the officer and you're looking at the enlisted, and you need them to run the ship. The combat capability and efficiency of your ship is going to largely rest on the capabilities of your enlisted. They need the officers to direct them and tell them what they're supposed to be doing, but they're the ones who actually have to do the thing. And so if you look out for your men, if you essentially work with them and make sure that they're being well treated, well taken care of, they will usually reward you with a very happy, very well-run ship with very minimal problems. If you try and rule like an autocratic tyrant and treat them like the scum of the earth, chances are you will probably get a mutiny, and even if you don't, you're going to end up with a ship that really doesn't work very well. And then finally, again, this is more for leadership stuff, but it would be decide what kind of person you're going to be before the shells start flying. Specifically, in terms of officers, are you an officer who goes by the book or an officer who goes by the spirit of the law? Pick one and stick to it, because there's nothing worse than someone who can't do either. Now, as I've mentioned before in some other videos, and this is one of the reasons I really have an issue with Admiral Jean Soule of the Marine Nationale, there is a place in navies for by-the-book officers, and there's a place in navies for spirit-of-the-law officers. But a by-the-book officer who, when confronted with a situation that is outside the book, refuses to follow the book and seek outside assistance from superior officers, and instead just clams up and refuses to do anything, is a terrible officer. And likewise, an officer who usually plays by the spirit of the law, who then falls back on, but the letter of the law says this, when something is not to his liking, is a hypocritical officer and is going to, A, be very unpopular with his men and probably with his superiors, and B, with that kind of whiplash of command styles, is probably going to get him and his men all killed. A Reichspeer minister asks, when did breechblock guns for the navies or as naval armament come into play, and how did they influence ship design for turrets and magazines in the first 10 to 15 years after their introduction? Well, if you want to be really cheeky, they actually come about right at the dawn of putting guns on ships, because as you can see here, this is a gun from the Mary Rose. The breech loading cannon was actually a very early form of cannon. You can see the breech down there, and you'd load it up with powder and shot, and then you'd lift the entire thing, basically the entire rear half of the cannon, slot it into place, hopefully wedge it in securely with some wooden wedges, which would then secure it theoretically, like the blue touch paper, so to speak, and hope that it doesn't go flying whenever the charge reaches the gunpowder inside. But they go out of style in favour of muzzle loading cannon, relatively quickly. Apart from anything, this kind of breech design is very, very difficult to actually maneuver and is actually relatively unpopular aboard ships, despite the fact that in theory you could have several breaches ready to go and thus maintain a much higher rate of fire than with muzzle-loading guns. Nonetheless, I suspect you're asking about breech-loading breech-block guns from the other end of the spectrum, kind of the Victorian period, in which case, when do those come into play? Late 1850s, basically. How do they influence turret and magazine designs in the first 10 to 15 years after their introduction? Magazine designs, they don't really influence all that much because you're still talking about extremely manually loaded guns. If you start looking at when breech loaders seriously start to reappear in 19th century ships in, let's say, the mid to late 1850s, and then you're going through to the 1870s, shell hoists, not really much of a thing. Towards the very end of the 1860s, going into the early 1870s, you're beginning to see some of it going on. But for the majority of the late 1850s and then through the 1860s, you're still talking about people physically lifting the shell or the shot, placing it within the gun, and then physically lifting the charge and placing it in the gun. There may be some hoists to bring charges up from the magazines to the deck level, but that's just because shot sizes are increasing quite dramatically, and you've got explosive shells which need to be kept in magazines and so forth, as opposed to solid iron shot, which, although there would be some magazines, you could keep a lot more of that out and about. So for the first 10 to 15 years after their introduction, breech loading guns aren't affecting the magazine design all that much. And similarly for turret design, the one thing that breech loaders offer when they're put in turrets in the 1860s, monitors and early ironclad warships, is that you can have your guns protruding somewhat more from the turret if you want. And generally speaking, overall, you can make the turret smaller with perhaps a slightly harder recoil compensator or recoil blocking devices, because you can reload them from the back. Whereas with muzzle loading weapons, you usually are relying on them being shot back far enough into the turret for you to then be able to access the muzzle to sponge it out, put in your new charges and shots and so on and so forth. And that's why a little bit later on you start to see loading mechanisms actually outside of the turret and the gun pointing down. Whereas obviously with a breech loading gun, that's irrelevant. You actually want more space at the back. With a muzzle loading gun, if the back of the gun is actually gone almost all the way to the other side of the turret, it doesn't make much odds. With a breech loading gun, that means you couldn't reload it. So the magazine design, not a huge effect. Turret design, breech loading guns in turrets are a much more efficient way of doing things than muzzle loading guns in turrets, which is why they would eventually take over from the muzzle loader. The Royal Navy's somewhat paranoia about breech loading guns following the Armstrong 110-pounder debacle notwithstanding. Dylan Bartlett asks, during the Battle of Elli, the Ottomans had 4 capital ships aside from the 2 Brandenburg-class. What were the other 2 ships? Is it safe to assume they were modernized ironclads? And if so, what were they armed with? You would be correct. These were, in fact, the modernized ironclads, and I apologize to Turkish speakers now. I believe it's Mesudaye and Asar-i Tevfik. I hope that's vaguely correct. And, well, this is Mesudaye. It's actually relatively difficult to find decent photos of her post-reconstruction, but both ironclads have been reconstructed in the 1900s. And yeah, you wouldn't guess this was originally a central battery ironclad with multiple masts, would you? You'd look at it and think, this looks like some kind of slightly odd cruiser, maybe a slightly small pre-dreadnought battleship, but no, this is actually a central battery ironclad, completely refitted and rebuilt into, what essentially is a small, theoretically pre-dreadnought battleship. They have very different armaments, though. Mesudaye, in theory, as you can see there's a turret with a single gun in forward position. In theory, it has a single 4-mounted 9-inch gun and an aft-mounted 9-inch gun in a turret. The turrets are there, but contrary to what the picture says, the guns themselves are not. They just put some dummies in. And instead, the actual armament is a dozen 5.9-inch guns, 6 per side, which you can see there in casemates, and then a whole slew of small anti-torpedo boat weapons, about almost 30 guns, actually, in 3 different calibers, because why not? So, on paper, she actually has a firepower similar to some of the early German attempts at pre-dreadnoughts, but in practice, she basically has the firepower of a mid-sized protected cruiser on a much larger hull and a slower speed. She would go on to be torpedoed and sunk in the First World War. The Asar Itavik is a much smaller vessel and has commensurately a much smaller armament. It's got some 57mm and 37mm anti-torpedo boat guns, but in its refitted configuration, it carries a main armament of 3 5.9-inch guns and 7 4.7-inch guns. And as far as I can tell from the relatively minimal, again, photographs and plans that survive, she appears to have mounted the 5.9-inch guns in a triangular formation, one on the bow and one either side of the bridge, with then the 4.7-inch guns running down either side of the ship, and the odd number accounting for the fact there's one at the stern. So those are the 2 ironclads. Those are the numbers of armament. So the Asar Itavik, 3 5.9-inch guns, 7 4.7-inch guns, and I'm pretty sure the gun layouts are correct. Ash the Lego guy asks, before the creation of powered tugboats, how do they manoeuvre large sail-powered ships of the line into ports and dockyards? The short answer is quite often they didn't. Large sailing ships prior to the invention of the tugboat in the beginning of the 1800s tended to just sit out in the wider reaches of ports and harbours, and people and goods that were coming to and from the shore tended to go to and from shore via the ship's boats or lighters from the shore. For example, when Nelson goes out to HMS Victory to sail down to what will eventually become the Battle of Trafalgar, Victory isn't tied up at quayside or anything. She's riding at anchor out in Portsmouth Harbour, and he has to board a boat, and the boat then rows him out to the ship, simply because it's actually very difficult to get a large sail-powered ship of the line up close and personal to a quay or pier or whatever safely without something going horribly wrong. But nonetheless, this did have to happen occasionally, whether the ship's going into Drydock, or, as you can see here, ships going into ordinary, or being disarmed or rearmed or whatever. If it was necessary, you would try and look for the best tidal and wind conditions to sort of gently nudge the ship in the direction you want it to go. But then, depending on the facilities of the harbour, you would use a combination of the ship's own boats with the ship's own crew rowing and thus basically forming human-powered tugboats. You might also have boats from the harbour itself, and potentially even smaller ships, sail-powered ships that are handier under the wind, that would also potentially act as tug or guide boats. And in very close confined quarters, although this was more often used to get out of port than into port, but occasionally could also be used to get in, you would have what was called, in some accounts, kedging. They've heard of kedge anchors, or warping, various terms for it, and sometimes those terms come to mean different things later on. But essentially, what it involves is, especially if it's very calm, would be a ship would let its anchor out a little bit, and then the anchor would be attached to a buoy or lowered onto one of the ship's boats, or in some way conveyed, either attached by the buoy to the ship's boat or on the ship's boat, or whatever. But basically, the idea is the ship's boats would take the ship's anchors forward to wherever it wanted to be, and then they would let the anchors go in that place. Obviously, the ship would be loosing the chains or ropes. The anchor would sink down, bite into the seabed with any luck, and then the ship would wind in its capstans, and in theory, if the anchor had stuck well enough, the ship would be hauled slowly into position, wherever that anchor happened to be. And you could repeat this to get yourself into or out of harbour if you absolutely had to, but it was a very laborious, difficult process and not something that was very popular. So usually you'd use either your own boats or nearby boats and small ships to essentially help you in, but you had to, as I say, time it very much with the tides and the currents and the wind, because all of that effort could be completely for nothing if you were trying to get one way and the wind decided that actually it's going to blow very strongly going the other way. Greg M. asks, John of Gaunt crossed waters for military purposes several times. Whilst his land campaigns are well documented, what is known about his fleets and their experiences? Whilst I am a medieval reenactor and a historian of naval matters, I must admit my knowledge of John of Gaunt's naval expeditions is relatively limited, and I did try and do some research. Perhaps someone has done some more extensive research than I've been able to. I did look into it, but I wasn't able to find a huge amount. And I did do some fairly deep dives. So there is a considerable amount of information available from very old records about the makeup of his ships, pay records and things like that. So we can say, roughly this ship would have been about this big, either depending on its stated tonnage, which would have, of course, been cargo tonnage, not displacement tonnage, and the number of men aboard, and so on and so forth. But, and theoretically, the number of ships as well, assuming that we haven't lost pages of documents. But, for the most part, his adult military naval activity basically seems to have been the way that most medieval naval activity at the period was. A bunch of people get on the ships sail to a destination, they land, they get out of the ships, and they conduct a land campaign. There are one or two what you might call minor naval incidents, but they're not naval battles. They're more kind of, we've turned up at this port where we intend to land, and we found the enemy have a bunch of ships here, so we're going to either capture or set fire to them, as the case may be, before we conduct our main landing operations. But that's not really a battle, because the enemy ships are usually either riding at anchor or just tied up and not really in a place to offer much resistance. The only real major naval engagement, like full-on battle, that John of Gaunt seems to have been part of, at least as far as I can tell, was the Battle of Winchelsea. Went back when he was 10, so he was more of a interested observer than anything else at that particular fight. Bearing in mind that he's born the same year as the Battle of Sluis, which is the biggest naval engagement for the English fleet in the 14th century, and the only naval battle that really coincides with it, where there's an English fleet facing off against anyone else at any great scale during his active period, which is the latter part of the 14th century, is the Battle of Margate in 1387, and that's under the command of the Earl of Arundel during a time when John of Gaunt is off trying to become King of Castile in the Iberian Peninsula. John McCarthy asks, the night after the Battle of Jutland, the German High Seas Fleet cut across the rear of the British cruising formation. There were several encounters with gunfire and torpedoes in the water, but none of the senior officers saw fit to tell Jellicoe about what was happening. 2 questions. What did the Royal Navy do afterwards to make sure they never again had another communication breakdown like that? And second, please speculate on what Jellicoe might have done if he had been aware of the High Seas Fleet's movement. To avoid a repeat of the communications problems, orders were promulgated throughout the fleet that, if you see something, you need to report it, no questions asked. Basically emphasizing to people what they should have known already. The other aspect to it was that the Royal Navy decided, in a slightly more long-term basis, that they were really going to get stuck into this whole night fighting thing, which of course also emphasized being able to communicate with people particularly well using signal lights and things, because of course signal flags not really so visible at night. And so the Royal Navy went from a force in World War I that for the most part was at a significant disadvantage when going up in night actions against its most likely opponents, i.e. the High Seas Fleet, which was quite well trained for it as far as you could do in World War I, to, by World War II, having essentially worked themselves to the bone in the interwar period, refining their night fighting techniques. The Royal Navy that entered World War II was amongst the world's most preeminent navies in night fighting tactics, capability and doctrine, which, as I pointed out before, they actually proved pretty well, because the first night encounter between the Royal Navy and the Japanese was a British victory. Now, as far as what Jellicoe might have done had he been aware of the High Seas Fleet's movements, we don't actually have to speculate. Jellicoe, in his own words, actually tells us what he would have done. Jellicoe was perfectly aware that the Germans were better at night fighting than his own ships were, and therefore he had no particular desire to try and engage the German fleet at night, apart from anything else. Even if all things had been equal, a confused night action melee favours the smaller fleet, because you're just as likely to shoot at friends as you are at as enemies in some of the worst of the confusion. Just see the naval action of Guadalcanal, the fight against Hiei and Kirishima for that. And therefore, the fleet with more ships around is more likely to be shot at by both the enemy and its own. So it's a disadvantage, as I say, even if the training was okay. And so what Jellicoe's plan was if he had known what the High Seas Fleet was doing, he would have been able to divine from their course which of the three possible ways back to Wilhelmshaven they were taking, at which point he would have ordered Beatty and his battle cruisers, who at the time the Germans were cutting across the back were much further south. He would have ordered them to head straight for the new destination that he thought the Germans were going for at speed, and his own fleet would have headed that way after disengaging from the Germans, also at speed, because the battle cruiser fleet has a significant speed advantage over the Germans, and the Grand Fleet actually also has a speed advantage over the Germans, both just about a little bit before the battle, and certainly by this stage of the battle, when a lot of the Germans' engines are choking up with, because of the poor quality coal, they have actually quite a significant speed advantage. And Jellicoe would have then sought to position his vessels as effectively a line of battle, preventing the Germans from entering through the safe passage through the minefields that he knew were there, and thus forcing the Germans, who at that point would have been low on fuel, and in some cases like Seydlitz quite badly damaged and leaking, to basically have to try and fight their way through the Grand Fleet to get to safety. And of course they would be shot on the way in, and they'd be shot on the way out, and they would actually be very limited in what they could do, because if they're trying to fight their way in, they have to come in pretty much bow on, so they're going to be limited in what weapons they can deploy. And if they choose to turn broadside and have a full fleet action there and then, well, that's in Jellicoe's favour, because he's got a lot more ships with a lot more guns. Also, by fighting an action in the early morning in that way, he would have had the sun rising behind him, sun rising in the east, which would have significantly disadvantaged the Germans, because whilst you could argue it might silhouette the British, which it would have silhouetted the British and hidden the Germans in the murk for a very short period of time, for the vast majority of the morning, the Germans would have had a low morning sun in their eyes, whilst the British would have had, after that early morning murk clears, had the Germans quite nicely lit up. Chief Eyeroll asks, in the World at War series, episode Wolfpack, the British convoy HG-76 from Gibraltar to Britain is highlighted as an important event in the Battle of the Atlantic. Was the convoy truly as seminal an event as Laurence Olivier recounted? Exactly which convoy is the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic is a little bit all over the place. Most people cite ONS 5 as the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, but HG-76 is quite an important battle for a number of reasons. It sees the use of and the loss of the escort carrier HMS Audacity, but it's a good showcase of multiple different factors. You've got Johnny Walker there with his escort group, and it's actually one of the first convoys where there's determined U-boat attacks, but U-boat losses exceed the number of merchant ships sunk. At least 4 U-boats are sunk, many others are damaged, and a lot of U-boat attacks are driven off completely in exchange for the loss of 1 destroyer escort or escorting destroyer, 2 merchant ships, which do get sunk, and the Audacity itself. And the loss of Audacity and at least one of the merchant ships is largely down to Walker pulling off a rather good plan to try and counterattack the U-boats and get the convoy out of the way to safety, and one of the merchant ships screws it up by firing star shells in the middle of it all, and basically gives away the entire plan, which is now detached the escort group from the convoy, which gives the Germans an opportunity to attack, and obviously they take out merchant ship and Audacity herself. But even if you count Audacity and the destroyer, that's 4 for 4. And the British can afford to trade a couple of merchant ships and an old destroyer for 3 U-boats. Not necessarily particularly keen on trading a U-boat for an escort carrier, to be fair. But that's, as I said, a little bit of a slight difference. But the other thing that it shows is Audacity's martlets, i.e. Wildcats, shoot down a couple of FW200 Condors. So the Condors tracking and reporting the position of the convoys has also been a fairly major problem. So HG-76 as a action in and of itself is very good at showcasing early use of escort carriers, how effective they can be at driving off and sinking submarines, how effective they can be at driving off and shooting down patrolling escorts, and also patrolling Commodores, and also how effective the hunter-killer escort groups, as exemplified by Johnny Walker, are at, again, keeping the U-boats away and sinking them, because there were a lot of U-boats trying to attack this convoy, and they suffered for it. Chris Gregory asks, what, in your opinion, was the single most significant technological advancement made between 1919 and 1938 with respect to naval matters? I think I pretty much have to go with radar. Sonar would be another good one to go for. You know, there's a lot of different things that you can... Aircraft, for example. But radar I would go for, partly because radar is invented in that time period. Aircraft are a very decisive thing. Sonar's a very decisive thing as well, but both of them have their origins, or in the case of aircraft, full use, before 1919. So they're pre-existing technologies that undergo further development. Radar is an advancement wholesale made during this time period, and it has a absolutely massive effect on naval matters in all sorts of respects. Now, obviously, it is very easy to overstate the role of radar in World War II, especially in the first half, when it's not quite as capable and not quite as common. But once you get to the mid-war period and radar really hits its stride, you have, so many things that change as a result of radar. To list off a few, night fighting becomes less a matter of trying to gather in visual light and people physically spotting things, and it becomes more a matter of what can you see on radar, because radar massively outranges and offers more clarity. Likewise, weather, squall, smoke, etc. Things that in the interwar period huge amounts of effort were invested in as methods of concealment don't really mean all that much against radar. Gunnery control, obviously precise, ongoing, accurate data for calibrating your fire control tables. Similarly for anti-aircraft gunnery, as opposed to here's a round ring sight, have fun, or some of the early war optical attempts at optical range finding and fire control for anti-aircraft gunnery, which, to be fair, some of them weren't terrible, but radar-directed anti-aircraft gunnery is much better. And linked to that, the search capabilities, not just on the surface in bad weather, but against aircraft generally. I've discussed in the past how, everything from the US Navy's carrier tactics in the interwar period that they put into effect in the early part of World War II, to some influencing factors on the Royal Navy's decision to implement armoured flight deck carriers with smaller air groups as opposed to less well-armoured carriers with larger air groups. All of that and more is all tied into the fact that aircraft in the mid to late 1930s are capable of showing up on the horizon and closing the distance from there to you, to hit you, really before you can do all that much about it. You basically have to rely on your anti-aircraft defences and whatever combat air patrol aircraft you've got up in the sky, because even if you launch combat air patrol aircraft the instant you spot enemy bombers crossing the horizon, they're going to be in range and attacking you before your freshly launched combat air patrol fighters can do anything but engage maybe some of the torpedo bombers. And that's if you've managed to get them off of the flight deck in the first place. Whereas air search radar completely negates all of that. Air search radar now makes sticking together, rather than operating in independent groups as the US Navy was doing, a much better option for defence, because now crowding your defences together is better than scattering yourselves and hoping you don't get seen. Likewise for the Royal Navy, having more aircraft suddenly becomes more important because now you actually have a chance to utilize those in defense of the fleet instead of having to essentially turtle up against incoming fire. And then, of course, as radar gets better and better, you can start detecting U-boat periscopes, both from ship-mounted and air-mounted radars. The radar allows you to construct in early homing weapons, although that's a little bit past 1938, etc., etc., etc. Mark Griffiths asks, who had more impact on Japanese maritime thought and doctrine, Togo or Yamamoto? Now, I know some people will disagree with me because this is still a matter of contention amongst naval historians generally, but in my opinion, Togo is the one who had the greatest impact. Now, the reason I say that is because Admiral Togo's career, when he not even just his entire naval career, just the time he's in relatively senior command positions, he starts off with a Japanese Navy that is essentially trying to follow the je ne sais style of the French Navy at the time, with a little bit of other naval styles thrown in. And between Togo and other officers, especially once Togo obviously reaches higher rank, he is more in favour of the Royal Navy school of thought when it comes to fighting battles. And then, of course, he leads the Japanese to victory at Tsushima. And so over the course of the time when Togo is in command as an admiral of varying ranks, and especially later on when he's in senior positions, he oversees or is part of the Japanese Navy transforming from a je ne sais style Navy to a full battle fleet, decisive battle doctrine style Navy. Now, whether or not that's necessarily a good idea with how far the Japanese took that idea is another matter, but it is a complete paradigm shift for how the Japanese utilize their Navy. Now, Yamamoto, while he did have a very significant impact on how Japan executed their strategy and developed their tactics, personally, I see Yamamoto as operating within the framework set up by Togo. Togo gives the Japanese the idea that they can win wars through decisive naval battles, mostly by Tsushima, but also by general thought and influence. Yamamoto, whilst he does make a number of refinements in how the Japanese plan to fight a war to achieve a decisive battle in naval terms and then carry that forward to winning a war, he doesn't offer any radical change in Japanese doctrine. The Japanese doctrine is always, during Yamamoto's time period, to seek to fight a decisive action. Yamamoto is just trying to decide and influence how they're going to fight that action. Whereas Togo is the one who decided that they were going to fight the decisive action in the first place, which is the much larger impact, at least in my opinion. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, were there ever any plans to upgun the King George V class ships to have larger guns? No, there weren't. As I've covered before, in actual fact, the King George V were downgraded from an initial thought of 15-inch guns to the 14-inch gun. But when it came to upgrading them, by the time the King George V's were in a position to theoretically be upgunned, post-World War II, because they're coming into service during the war, and there's better things to do during a war than completely rework your battleship. You need to get them out in service ASAP if they're modern. But post-war, the age of the battleship is seen to have come to an end, so there's not really any drive to do that anyway. But even if there hadn't been a war, or if there had been other circumstances around, then they still wouldn't have been able to upgun the ships because of one reason. That's called B-turret. As you can see here, B-turret is the twin turret. And whilst you can broadly follow the idea of reduce the guns by 1 and upgrade the caliber by 2 inches, which would allow you to have, if you had the the up to the last minute final King George V design with 3 quads, that could have allowed you to go to 3 1616s, which is basically what the first draft line designs were. Essentially, here's a King George V class, except we've slightly reshaped the bow and replaced 3 quadruple 14-inch turrets with 3 triple 16-inch. That's not possible when you have a twin gun turret, because the only upgunning possible there is a single gun turret, which, yeah, that's not going to happen. And otherwise, you're talking about ripping out the entire barbette, expanding it, if there is even room to expand into, which there may not be, and so on and so forth. So yeah, the King George V with that 424 turret layout, they're stuck with the 14-inch guns whether they like it or not, unless somebody can come up with a fractionally larger gun that might just about be able to be squeezed in, like, say, a 15-inch. But I doubt it. And finally, for this half, Andrew Waite asks, can you explain the nature of HMS Warspite's steering problems? How her steering was damaged during the Battle of Jutland, how the problems manifested themselves later in her career, and why they weren't fixed by her late 1930s rebuild in Portsmouth. So, exactly why Warspite continued to have steering problems after that jam at the Battle of Jutland throughout her life is one of life's enduring mysteries. There are a number of theories advanced to explain it. The problem is that most of them rely on something to do with the Queen Elizabeth class, but then in theory the other 4 ships should have suffered from the same problem, and they don't. The best theory that I've come across, and probably explains it, at least in my opinion, is to do with the damage she took at Jutland compounded with an issue that actually was common to the Queen Elizabeth class. And for reference, the problems tended to manifest when Warspite was moving at high speed, and then she tried to put a rudder hard over. So that combination of high speed and a rudder hard over would sometimes cause the rudder to jam, and then she'd go off wildly in circles, which was not necessarily particularly welcome most of the time. The way I've most convincingly seen it explained is that the Queen Elizabeth class, because of their higher speed, but combined with a whole form of battleships of World War I period, if you put the steering hard over, you created quite a bit of vibration due to where the water was streaming off of the propellers, on either the port or starboard side, and how that interacted with the plane that's presented by the rudder. Now, that's going to be a problem common to all 5 Queen Elizabeth class. However, it is then theorised that the damage from the shells that hit Warspite and caused the steering jam in the first place, or just the general damage that caused the steering issue, may be something very, very small, relatively speaking, and relatively undetectable. So obviously, you know, if say, the rudder shaft or the rudder bracket or something like that had a visible massive warp on it, it would have had to have been fixed, probably replaced. But the theory goes that perhaps there was just the slightest bit of warpage, not enough to cause problems normally and not enough to justify replacement, even if anyone noticed it, perhaps. You know, maybe just a bit of transmitted shock somewhere or other, but it would have involved just the slightest kink, either in the rudder shaft itself or the bracket, the tunnel that the rudder shaft runs up, or possibly both. And under normal circumstances, this slight distortion was not enough to cause any problems. It was well within tolerance. But in a high-speed, high-angle turn, when there's a lot of vibration being set up, whereas in a normal Queen Elizabeth class, where the thing's running straight and true, that might still be within tolerance, or might, you know, if it is causing any interaction, is causing interaction along the whole length. On Warspite, that would have caused a point source interaction with considerably more friction, and once that occurs, things start to get jammed, and all of a sudden things have gotten horribly, horribly wrong, and the only way to solve the situation is actually, as it turns out, they did develop techniques eventually to try and reduce the problem or prevent it happening, which was called an easing operation, which seems to have reduced the interference and vibration between the rudder and the propellers somewhat, although the details from what I could find are relatively unclear on exactly how that's done, but it seems to have reduced the incidences of the steering jamming, unless, of course, operations demanded you just slam the rudder hard over in an evasive action, at which point it's just as likely to pop up and come back. So, you know, not an entirely 100% cure. And that's it for the first half. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are, and it's time to head on to the second half, so see you over there at some point.